Welcome to Night Mind Academy. Tonight, we're diving into some of the most mind-bending paradoxes ever conceived. These are the strange loops of logic, the questions without clean answers, and the riddles that challenge how we understand reality itself. From time travel contradictions to puzzles about truth, identity, and free will, each paradox pulls at the threads of what we think we know. They're confusing, fascinating, and a little unsettling, perfect fuel for late-night wonder. If you enjoy exploring the mysteries of the mind and the universe, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a new deep dive. Now, let's unravel the paradox. Bootstrap Paradox. Imagine you're sitting in your room one day when suddenly an older version of yourself appears through a shimmering portal. This future you hands over the blueprints for a time machine, explaining that you'll need these plans to build the device that will eventually allow you to travel back to this very moment. You take the blueprints, study them carefully, and over the next few years you successfully construct the time machine. Decades later, you step into your completed machine and travel back in time to give your younger self those same blueprints. Now here's the question that should make your brain hurt: where did those blueprints actually come from? This is the Bootstrap Paradox, named after the phrase, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, which describes an impossible action. The paradox emerges whenever information or objects exist without ever being created. In our example, the blueprints were never invented by anyone. Your older self didn't create them, you simply received them. Your younger self didn't create them either, you just copied what you were given. The plans exist in an endless loop with no point of origin, no moment of creation, no inventor. They simply are, trapped in a circle of causality that has no beginning. The Bootstrap Paradox appears frequently in time travel stories and raises fundamental questions about cause and effect. We're used to living in a world where every effect has a cause, where everything that exists came from somewhere. A book was written by an author. A song was composed by a musician. A machine was designed by an engineer. But in a Bootstrap Paradox, the normal chain of causation is replaced by a closed loop. The effect becomes its own cause, creating a circular relationship that violates our intuitive understanding of how time and causality should work. Consider another example. Imagine a famous symphony that exists only because a time traveler went back and gave it to a young composer, who then published it under their own name. That composer grows old, and before dying, gives the sheet music to a young time traveler, who takes it back in time to give to the composer. The symphony is celebrated for centuries, but who actually wrote those notes? Who arranged those melodies? The answer is nobody and everybody simultaneously. Scientists and philosophers debate whether such paradoxes prove that time travel is impossible, or whether they reveal something strange about the nature of causality itself. Some argue that the universe would prevent bootstrap paradoxes through some unknown mechanism, ensuring that cause and effect remain properly ordered. Others suggest that if time travel were possible, bootstrap paradoxes might simply be a weird but acceptable feature of reality. Perhaps causality doesn't need to be linear, they say. Perhaps closed causal loops are just as valid as the straight-line cause and effect relationships we're familiar with. The Bootstrap Paradox also appears in discussions about information theory and entropy. Information, like energy, should come from somewhere. It should be created through some process. But in a Bootstrap Paradox, information exists eternally without creation, seemingly violating thermodynamic principles. This suggests that either time travel works in ways we don't understand, or that these paradoxes point to fundamental impossibilities in the fabric of spacetime. What makes the Bootstrap Paradox particularly unsettling is that it creates something from nothing, not in space, but in time. The blueprints, the symphony, or whatever object is trapped in the loop has no origin story. It's as if the universe contains a glitch, a piece of reality that exists outside the normal rules. For those who love puzzles and mysteries, the Bootstrap Paradox remains one of the most elegant and troubling problems in theoretical physics and philosophy. The paradox of identity over time. Look at a photograph of yourself as a baby. That tiny human with chubby cheeks and innocent eyes is supposedly you, but is it really? Every cell in your body has been replaced multiple times since then. Your memories from that time are gone. Your personality bears little resemblance to that infant. Your physical appearance has changed dramatically. Your thoughts, beliefs, hopes, and dreams are entirely different. So in what meaningful sense are you the same person as that baby in the photograph? This question sits at the heart of the paradox of identity over time. The ancient Greek philosopher Plutarch illustrated this problem with the ship of Theseus, a thought experiment that has puzzled thinkers for thousands of years. Imagine a wooden ship that sails the seas for decades. Over time, as planks rot and break, they're replaced with new wood. Eventually, after many years, every single plank, mast, and rope has been replaced. Not one piece of the original ship remains. Is it still the same ship? Most people's intuition says yes, it's the same ship, just maintained over time. But now imagine that someone collected all the original rotted planks, stored them carefully, and then rebuilt a ship using only those original pieces. Now you have two ships, one made entirely of new materials but claiming continuity with the original through gradual replacement, and one made entirely of original materials but disassembled and reassembled. Which one is the real ship of Theseus? Both have legitimate claims to the identity. This paradox becomes even more personal when we apply it to human beings. Scientists tell us that most cells in our bodies are replaced over time, though at different rates. Skin cells regenerate constantly, while neurons can last a lifetime. The atoms that make up our bodies are exchanged with the environment through eating, breathing, and metabolism. Within about 7 to 10 years, the vast majority of our physical matter is different. Are you the same person you were a decade ago? Some philosophers argue that identity persists through psychological continuity rather than physical continuity. As long as your memories, personality traits, and sense of self flow continuously from past to present, you remain the same person despite physical changes. But this solution creates its own problems. People's personalities change dramatically over their lifetimes. Memories fade, become distorted, or disappear entirely. Someone with amnesia who cannot remember their past might still be considered the same person legally and socially, but what makes them so if psychological continuity is broken? The paradox deepens when we consider hypothetical scenarios. If scientists could scan your brain, destroy your body, and recreate you atom by atom in another location, would the recreated person be you or a copy? If technology could upload your consciousness into a computer, would that digital mind be you or merely a simulation of you? What if the process created two copies, both with identical memories and personalities? They can't both be you, but how do we decide which one is? This isn't just philosophical speculation, it has real implications for how we think about personal responsibility, medical ethics, and legal rights. If someone commits a crime and then undergoes radical personality change, are they still the same person who should be punished? When we make promises or sign contracts, we assume our future self will honor them, but what obligates a significantly changed person to fulfill commitments made by who they used to be? The paradox of identity over time reveals that our intuitive sense of personal identity may be more complicated and fragile than we'd like to believe. We feel like unified, continuous beings moving through time, but upon close examination, this continuity becomes difficult to defend philosophically. Perhaps identity is not a binary yes or no question but something more fluid and conventional, something we assign rather than discover. Or perhaps there's some deeper truth about consciousness and selfhood that we haven't yet grasped. The Sorites Paradox, the Heap. Imagine you're standing before a large pile of sand containing 10,000 grains. Everyone would agree this is clearly a heap. Now, remove a single grain of sand. You still have a heap, obviously. Removing one grain from 10,000 couldn't possibly transform a heap into a non-heap. Remove another grain. Still a heap. Another grain. Still a heap. You continue this process, removing one grain at a time, and each removal seems too insignificant to matter. But eventually, you're left with just 2 grains of sand, then 1 grain, then none at all. At some point, the heap stopped being a heap, but when exactly did that happen? After which specific grain did the heap cease to exist? This is the Sorites paradox, from the ancient Greek word soros, meaning heap. It was formulated over 2,000 years ago, yet it continues to baffle philosophers and challenge our understanding of language, logic, and reality. The paradox exploits the vagueness inherent in many of our everyday concepts. Words like heap, bald, tall, rich, and bold don't have precise boundaries. They describe properties that exist on a continuum, and we struggle to identify the exact moment when something transitions from one category to another. Let's apply the paradox to baldness, a classic example. A person with a full head of hair is definitely not bald. Losing one hair doesn't make them bald. Losing another single hair doesn't either. The removal of any single hair seems too trivial to create baldness where none existed before. But if we accept this reasoning, we must conclude that someone could lose every hair on their head and still not be bald, which is absurd. Yet we also can't point to the loss of any specific hair, the 23rd or the 4,712th, and say, that's the one that made them bald. The paradox creates a logical trap. It starts with a clearly true premise: 10,000 grains make a heap. What makes the Sorites paradox so persistent is that it reveals a fundamental tension between the discrete nature of logic and language and the continuous nature of many phenomena in the world. Our minds want clear categories and definite boundaries, but reality often refuses to cooperate. The paradox demonstrates that vagueness isn't just a linguistic inconvenience to be eliminated through better definitions. It's a deep feature of how we conceptualize and interact with the world, one that resists simple solutions despite centuries of philosophical effort. The Barber Paradox. In a small village, there lives a barber who follows one simple rule: he shaves all and only those men in the village who do not shave themselves. This seems like a perfectly reasonable arrangement at first glance. Some men in the village prefer to shave themselves at home, while others visit the barber for their grooming needs. The barber's rule clearly defines his clientele, avoiding any confusion about who should come to his shop. But now, let's ask a seemingly innocent question: does the barber shave himself? If we say the barber does shave himself, then according to his rule, he should not shave himself, because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if we say the barber does not shave himself, then according to his rule, he must shave himself, because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves. We've arrived at a contradiction either way. If he shaves himself, he doesn't. If he doesn't shave himself, he does. The barber is trapped in a logical impossibility of his own making. This paradox was formulated by the British philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell in 1902, and it's actually a simplified version of a more technical problem he discovered in set theory. Russell was investigating the foundations of mathematics when he stumbled upon a contradiction that threatened the logical consistency of the entire mathematical enterprise. The Barber Paradox illustrates this problem in a way that anyone can understand without needing advanced mathematical training. The deeper issue revealed by this paradox concerns self-reference and the dangers of unrestricted comprehension. In logic and mathematics, we often want to define sets by stating a property that all members share. For example, the set of all even numbers, or the set of all red things. Russell discovered that allowing completely unrestricted set formation leads to contradictions. His original version asked, does the set of all sets that do not contain themselves contain itself? This is logically equivalent to asking whether the barber shaves himself. What makes the Barber Paradox so troubling is that it arises from seemingly innocent and reasonable premises. There's nothing obviously wrong with the barber's rule when we first hear it. The contradiction only emerges when we apply the rule to the barber himself. This demonstrates that our intuitions about logic and definition can mislead us, and that we must be extremely careful when creating rules or definitions that refer back to themselves. Philosophers and mathematicians have proposed various solutions to Russell's paradox and its variants. One approach is to restrict what kinds of sets can be formed, disallowing sets that contain themselves or refer to themselves in problematic ways. This is the approach taken by most modern set theory, which includes axioms specifically designed to avoid Russell-type paradoxes. Another approach is to accept that some statements are neither true nor false but meaningless or ill-formed. According to this view, asking whether the barber shaves himself is like asking what color the number 7 smells like. It's a category error that doesn't deserve an answer. Some logicians have developed alternative logical systems that can handle self-reference without contradiction, including paraconsistent logics that allow certain contradictions to exist without causing the entire system to collapse. These systems suggest that perhaps we've been too rigid in demanding that everything must be either true or false, never both. The Barber Paradox also has implications beyond pure mathematics and logic. It teaches us to be suspicious of absolute rules and universal statements, especially those that might apply to themselves. In everyday life, we often encounter policies or principles that seem sensible until we consider edge cases or self-application. Laws that regulate lawmakers, rules about rulemaking, and meta-policies that govern policy creation all potentially face versions of this problem. What's particularly elegant about the Barber Paradox is how it takes an abstract logical problem and presents it through a concrete, almost comical scenario. We can picture this poor barber, standing in his shop with a razor in hand, paralyzed by the logical impossibility of his situation. The paradox reminds us that logic, despite being the foundation of rational thought, contains traps and pitfalls. Even the most carefully constructed rules can harbor contradictions, and sometimes the only solution is to recognize that certain questions, despite appearing perfectly well-formed, simply cannot be answered within the system that generated them. Quantum immortality. Imagine you're standing before a strange machine, a quantum gun that will either fire or not fire based on the decay of a radioactive atom. According to quantum mechanics, until the moment of measurement, the atom exists in a superposition of both decayed and not decayed states. When you pull the trigger, the universe splits into two branches. In one branch the atom has decayed and the gun fires, killing you instantly. In the other branch, the atom hasn't decayed and the gun doesn't fire, leaving you alive. Here's the disturbing question: from your subjective perspective, which outcome will you experience? According to the thought experiment known as quantum immortality, you can only experience the branch where you survive. In the branch where the gun fires, there's no you left to have experiences. Your consciousness, your subjective awareness, can only continue along the timeline where you remain alive. So you pull the trigger, the gun doesn't fire, and you survive. You pull the trigger again, and again you survive. You could pull that trigger 1,000 times, and from your perspective, you would survive every single time, even though the probability of this is astronomically small. This idea emerges from a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics called the many-worlds interpretation. According to this view, every quantum event causes the universe to split into multiple parallel universes, one for each possible outcome. When that radioactive atom either decays or doesn't decay, both outcomes occur, but in different branches of reality. Most versions of you die, but there's always at least one version that survives, and that's the only version whose perspective you can experience. The implications are deeply unsettling. If quantum immortality is real, then from your subjective viewpoint, you can never die. Every potentially fatal event, whether it's a car accident, a disease, or old age, involves countless quantum events. In most branches of reality you die, but there will always be some branch, however improbable, where you survive. Your consciousness would continue to experience existence, jumping from one unlikely survival to the next, watching everyone around you age and die while you persist through increasingly improbable circumstances. Critics of quantum immortality raise several powerful objections. First, it assumes that consciousness somehow follows the branches where you survive, but why should consciousness work this way? Perhaps when most versions of you die, your subjective experience simply ends, regardless of whether some versions survive elsewhere. The thought experiment treats consciousness as something that must continue, but this assumption may be unwarranted. Second, even if consciousness does follow surviving branches, this doesn't mean you would experience subjective immortality in any pleasant sense. Most survival scenarios would involve horrible outcomes. Imagine pulling that quantum trigger and surviving, but with severe brain damage that leaves you barely conscious. Your awareness continues, but in a state of profound suffering or diminished capacity. The anthropic principle might force you to experience survival, but it doesn't guarantee the quality of that survival. Third, quantum immortality seems to confuse the map with the territory. The many worlds interpretation is one way of understanding quantum mechanics, but it's not clear that all these parallel universes literally exist in some physical sense. They might be mathematical artifacts of our best models rather than actual realities. If the parallel universes aren't real, then neither is quantum immortality. The thought experiment also raises questions about personal identity similar to those we've explored elsewhere. If the universe is constantly splitting into branches, with slightly different versions of you existing in each branch, which one is the real you? When the quantum gun fires and kills you in one branch while you survive in another, has the real you died or survived? If both versions are equally you before the split, how can we say that you survive just because one version continues? Despite these objections, quantum immortality remains a fascinating and disturbing thought experiment. It forces us to confront questions about the nature of consciousness, personal identity, and the interpretation of quantum mechanics. It also highlights how our intuitions about death and survival may need revision if certain interpretations of physics are correct. For most physicists and philosophers, quantum immortality remains a curious speculation rather than a serious theory. The practical advice remains unchanged: don't pull the trigger on any gun, quantum or otherwise. But the thought experiment serves an important purpose by pushing our thinking about consciousness and quantum mechanics to their logical extremes, revealing hidden assumptions and unexplored implications. Whether or not you find the argument convincing, it demonstrates how modern physics can generate scenarios that would have seemed like pure fantasy to previous generations, yet which emerge naturally from our best scientific theories about how reality fundamentally works. The Paradox of the Court. In ancient Greece, there was a famous teacher of rhetoric named Protagoras who agreed to teach a poor student named Euathlus the art of law. The young man desperately wanted to become a lawyer but had no money to pay for his education. Protagoras proposed an unusual arrangement: Euathlus would pay nothing up front, but would pay the full tuition fee after he won his first court case. This seemed fair to both parties. The student would get his education without immediate financial burden, and the teacher would eventually receive payment once his student's career was launched. Euathlus studied diligently under Protagoras and completed his legal education. However, after graduating, he deliberately avoided taking any cases to court. Years passed, and Protagoras grew frustrated. He had provided a complete education but received no payment. Finally, the teacher decided to use the legal system himself. He took Euathlus to court, suing him for the tuition fee. This is where the paradox emerges in its full, beautiful symmetry. Protagoras argued his case cleverly: if I win this case, the court will order Euathlus to pay me, and I will receive my tuition fee. But if I lose this case, that means Euathlus has won his first case in court, which triggers our original agreement, and he must pay me the tuition fee. Either way, I win, and he must pay me. The logic seems airtight. Whether the court rules for or against Protagoras, the teacher gets paid. But Euathlus, having learned well from his teacher, offered an equally compelling counterargument: if I win this case, the court will rule that I don't owe Protagoras anything, and I won't have to pay. But if I lose this case, it means I still haven't won my first case, which means the condition of our agreement hasn't been met, and I still don't have to pay. Either way, I win, and I owe nothing. His logic appears equally valid. Whether the court rules for or against Euathlus, he owes nothing. Both arguments seem perfectly logical, yet they lead to completely contradictory conclusions. How can the court possibly rule on this case? If they rule for Protagoras, they're saying Euathlus must pay, but their ruling would also mean Euathlus lost his first case, which according to the contract means he doesn't have to pay. If they rule for Euathlus, they're saying he doesn't have to pay, but their ruling would also mean he won his first case, which according to the contract means he does have to pay. The paradox reveals deep problems with contracts that refer to their own enforcement, creating loops of self-reference similar to those we've seen in other paradoxes. The agreement between Protagoras and Euathlus contains a condition that depends on the outcome of potential legal proceedings, but those legal proceedings must interpret the very agreement whose conditions depend on their outcome. Legal scholars and philosophers have proposed various solutions. Some argue that the contract is simply invalid because it's self-contradictory or impossible to enforce. Courts generally avoid enforcing agreements that create logical impossibilities. Others suggest that the court should focus on the spirit of the agreement rather than its letter. Clearly, Protagoras intended to be paid once Euathlus became a practicing lawyer, and Euathlus' deliberate avoidance of court cases violates the good faith implied in their arrangement. Another approach distinguishes between the contractual obligation and the court's ruling. The contract might obligate Euathlus to pay after winning his first case, and this case brought by Protagoras is his first case. If Euathlus wins, the court's decision doesn't erase the contractual obligation that would be triggered by his victory. The court would rule that Euathlus must pay not because of the court's decision itself, but because the contract's condition has been satisfied. Some modern legal theorists use this paradox to illustrate the importance of careful contract drafting. The agreement between Protagoras and Euathlus should have specified a time limit or included provisions for what happens if the student doesn't take cases. Real contracts in legal systems today include many clauses designed to prevent exactly this kind of self-referential logical trap. The paradox also touches on questions about the relationship between logic, law, and justice. Should legal systems always follow pure logic even when it leads to absurd or unjust outcomes? Or should courts sometimes override strict logical analysis in favor of fairness and common sense? Most legal systems try to balance these concerns, using logical reasoning as a guide but allowing judges discretion to avoid results that violate fundamental principles of justice. What makes the paradox of the court enduringly fascinating is how it turns a simple fee agreement into a logical labyrinth. It demonstrates that even straightforward contracts can harbor hidden contradictions, and that self-reference in legal agreements can create situations where both parties have equally valid arguments for opposite conclusions. The poor ancient Greek judge hearing this case probably wished both Protagoras and Euathlus had studied something other than law. Liar Paradox. Consider this simple sentence: this statement is false. Now, try to determine whether it's true or false. If the statement is true, then what it says must be accurate, which means it is false. But if the statement is false, then what it says is incorrect, which means it must be true. We're caught in an endless loop, bouncing back and forth between true and false without ever finding solid ground. This is the liar paradox, one of the oldest and most stubbornly persistent problems in logic and philosophy. The paradox appears in various forms throughout history. The ancient Greek philosopher Epimenides, who was from Crete, allegedly said, "All Cretans are liars." If he's telling the truth, then he, being a Cretan, must be a liar, which means he's lying, which means not all Cretans are liars, which means he might be telling the truth. Around and around we go. The paradox has been reformulated countless times, but its core structure remains the same, a statement that refers to its own truth value in a way that creates an unresolvable contradiction. What makes the liar paradox so troubling is its simplicity. Unlike complex mathematical paradoxes that require advanced training to understand, anyone can grasp the liar paradox immediately. It uses basic language and straightforward reasoning, yet it produces a genuine logical contradiction. This suggests that something is fundamentally wrong with either our language, our logic, or our understanding of truth itself. Philosophers have proposed numerous solutions over the centuries, but none has achieved universal acceptance. One approach is to declare that liar sentences are meaningless or ill-formed. According to this view, not every grammatically correct sentence expresses a genuine proposition. Just as, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, is grammatically valid but semantically nonsensical, perhaps, this statement is false, looks like a proper statement but actually fails to express anything coherent. The sentence appears to say something but actually says nothing at all. Another solution involves restricting how truth predicates can be applied. Perhaps we need a hierarchy of truth, where statements about truth exist at different levels. A statement at one level can only describe the truth of statements at lower levels, never itself. This approach, developed by logician Alfred Tarski, successfully avoids the paradox by making self-referential truth claims impossible. However, critics argue that this solution is artificial and doesn't reflect how we actually use language, where self-reference seems perfectly natural and common. Some philosophers embrace paraconsistent logic, which allows contradictions to exist without causing the entire logical system to explode. In classical logic, if you accept a single contradiction, you can prove anything, a principle called the principle of explosion. Paraconsistent logic rejects this principle, allowing the liar sentence to be both true and false simultaneously without destroying the usefulness of logic for other purposes. This seems radical, but perhaps reality is more contradictory than we'd like to admit. Others argue that truth is context-dependent or that the liar sentence involves a kind of presupposition failure. When we say, this statement is false, we're presupposing that the statement has a definite truth value, but perhaps some statements simply lack truth values altogether. They're neither true nor false but occupy some third category, like undefined or indeterminate. The liar paradox has implications far beyond abstract philosophy. It touches on fundamental questions about the nature of truth, meaning, and reference. It challenges our confidence in language as a reliable tool for describing reality. If such a simple sentence can generate an unresolvable contradiction, how can we trust more complex statements? The paradox also appears in various disguised forms in mathematics, computer science, and even in discussions about consciousness and self-awareness. Consider the sentence, the next statement is true. The previous statement is false. These two sentences together create a liar paradox without either one being self-referential on its own. This shows that the problem isn't just about direct self-reference but about circular reference more generally. Anywhere you have sentences or propositions referring back to each other in certain ways, you risk creating similar contradictions. Modern computer scientists have discovered that the liar paradox has structural similarities to the halting problem and Gödel's incompleteness theorems, suggesting deep connections between self-reference, unprovability, and the limits of formal systems. These discoveries indicate that the liar paradox isn't just a quirky linguistic puzzle but a window into fundamental limitations on what can be proven or computed. The paradox also raises questions about semantic closure and whether natural languages can consistently contain their own truth predicates. Can English talk about the truth of English sentences without running into contradictions? Some philosophers argue that natural languages are inevitably inconsistent precisely because they allow unrestricted self-reference. Others believe that natural languages have implicit mechanisms for avoiding these contradictions, even if we haven't fully articulated what those mechanisms are. What makes the liar paradox enduringly fascinating is that it weaponizes our most basic logical tools against themselves. We use concepts like truth and falsity to make sense of the world, but when we turn these concepts back on themselves, they break down. The paradox has survived thousands of years of philosophical investigation not because philosophers are incompetent, but because it touches something genuinely deep and difficult about the relationship between language, thought, and reality. The unexpected lottery winner's doubt. Imagine your government announces a new lottery system. Officials declare that sometime during the next week, Monday through Friday, they will announce the lottery winner, but the announcement will be completely unexpected. No one will be able to predict with certainty which day the winner will be announced. This seems straightforward enough, but a clever citizen begins to reason about when the announcement could logically occur, and discovers something troubling. The citizen thinks, the announcement cannot happen on Friday. Why? Because if Friday arrives and no announcement has been made Monday through Thursday, then everyone would know with certainty that the announcement must come on Friday. But the government said the announcement would be unexpected, so Friday is impossible. This reasoning seems valid. Okay, so Friday is eliminated. Now, the citizen continues, the announcement cannot happen on Thursday either. Why not? Because we've already eliminated Friday, so if Thursday arrives and no announcement has been made, everyone would know the announcement must come on Thursday, making it expected rather than unexpected. Thursday is out. Following this same logic, Wednesday becomes impossible once Thursday is eliminated. Then Tuesday becomes impossible once Wednesday is ruled out. Finally, even Monday becomes impossible because with all other days eliminated, an announcement on Monday would be completely expected. The citizen concludes that an unexpected announcement during the week is logically impossible. The government's promise contains a hidden contradiction and therefore cannot be fulfilled. But here's the twist: on Wednesday afternoon, the government makes the announcement, and the citizen is genuinely surprised. Despite the seemingly airtight logical proof that no unexpected announcement could occur, it did occur, and it was unexpected. What went wrong with the reasoning? This is the unexpected lottery winner's doubt, also known as the surprise examination paradox or the unexpected hanging paradox. The paradox reveals something strange about the relationship between knowledge, expectation, and reasoning about the future. The citizen's backward reasoning from Friday seems valid at each step, yet it leads to a conclusion that's empirically false. We can actually schedule unexpected announcements, yet pure logic seems to prove this is impossible. How can experience and logic diverge so dramatically? One solution focuses on the concept of expectation and surprise. Perhaps the citizen confused knowing with certainty with having good reason to believe. Even if the citizen eliminates Friday through logical reasoning, this reasoning might be flawed in ways not immediately apparent. When Wednesday arrives, the citizen doesn't actually know the announcement will come that day, because the entire chain of reasoning was questionable from the start. The announcement can still be unexpected because the citizen's reasons for expecting or not expecting it on any given day were never as solid as they appeared. Another approach questions the backward induction reasoning itself. While each individual step seems valid, perhaps the reasoning fails when we try to chain these steps together. The argument assumes that if the citizen can prove no announcement will come on Friday, then this proof is common knowledge and can be used to reason about Thursday. But if the original reasoning is flawed, then basing further reasoning on it compounds the error. Some philosophers argue that the paradox arises from a confusion about what the government actually promised. Did they promise that the announcement would be unexpected by everyone, or just that it wouldn't be predictable with certainty? Did they promise it would remain unexpected even after certain forms of logical reasoning, or just that people wouldn't have prior information about the specific day? The exact interpretation of unexpected matters enormously, and different interpretations lead to different conclusions about whether the promise is contradictory. The paradox also touches on the limits of reasoning about one's own future knowledge states. When the citizen reasons that Friday is impossible because the announcement would be expected on Friday, this assumes the citizen will still trust their reasoning when Friday arrives. But if the reasoning leads to a contradiction by eliminating all days, perhaps the citizen should reject the reasoning rather than conclude the task is impossible. There's something self-undermining about reasoning that proves itself incorrect. In game theory and economics, similar paradoxes arise when reasoning about rational agents who no other rational agents are reasoning about them. If everyone knows everyone is perfectly rational and everyone knows what everyone else knows, sometimes you get strange logical loops where rational reasoning appears to prove that rational decisions are impossible. The unexpected lottery winner's doubt is a temporal version of these common knowledge paradoxes. The paradox has practical implications beyond logic puzzles. It suggests that certain kinds of surprises are possible even when people have logical and reasoning capabilities. You cannot always think your way out of uncertainty, and sometimes attempting to predict the unpredictable defeats itself. This has applications in military strategy, negotiations, and any situation where maintaining uncertainty provides strategic advantage. What makes this paradox particularly clever is how it uses seemingly valid reasoning to prove something that experience shows is false. We know unexpected announcements happen all the time. Teachers give surprise quizzes. Governments make unexpected announcements. Yet the logical argument seems to prove such things are impossible. The paradox forces us to find the flaw in reasoning that appears flawless, challenging our confidence in backward induction and our understanding of what it means for something to be unexpected or surprising. Friendship Paradox. Walk into any room full of people and randomly select someone. Ask them to count how many friends they have, then ask each of their friends to count their friends. On average, that person's friends will have more friends than they do. This seems impossible at first. Surely friendship should be symmetrical, an equal relationship. If you're my friend, I'm your friend, so our friend count should balance out over many people. Yet mathematical analysis proves this statement is generally true. Most people have fewer friends than their friends have. Welcome to the Friendship Paradox. The paradox was first described by sociologist Scott Feld in 1991, and it arises from a basic statistical truth about networks. People with many friends appear in more friendship networks than people with few friends. Imagine someone who has 100 friends. That person appears in 100 different people's friend groups. Now imagine someone who has only 2 friends. That person appears in only 2 friend groups. The person with many friends contributes their large friend count to many different averages, while the person with few friends contributes their small friend count to only a few averages. Let's make this concrete with a simple example. Imagine a party with 5 people. Alice has 4 friends at the party, Bob has 3 friends, Carol has 3 friends, David has 2 friends, and Emily has only 1 friend. The average number of friends is 2.6. Now let's calculate the average number of friends that each person's friends have. Alice's 4 friends have 3, 3, 2, and 1 friends respectively, averaging 2.25. But we need to weight these by how many times each person appears in friend networks. Popular people appear more often, pulling the average up. When you work through the mathematics properly, the average friend has more friends than the average person. This phenomenon has real implications for how we perceive our social lives. Most people feel less popular than their friends, and the friendship paradox explains why this feeling is mathematically inevitable rather than a sign of personal inadequacy. You're comparing yourself to a biased sample. Your friends are, by definition, people who have at least one friend, you, but they're also more likely to be relatively social people. The most isolated people aren't in your friend group at all, because they have no friends or very few friends. The friendship paradox extends far beyond simple friend counts. It applies to any network where nodes have connections, including professional networks, sexual networks, collaboration networks, and online social networks. On Twitter or Instagram, most people have fewer followers than the people they follow have. In academic citation networks, most papers are cited less frequently than the papers they cite. In airline route networks, most airports have fewer connections than the airports they connect to. The paradox has important applications in epidemiology and public health. Diseases spread through social networks, and the friendship paradox means that your friends are more likely to get sick before you do. This sounds counterintuitive, but it's because well-connected people get the disease earlier in an outbreak, and these are exactly the people who are disproportionately represented in everyone's friend groups. Public health officials can exploit this by monitoring friends of randomly selected people, getting early warning of disease spread. The same principle applies to information diffusion. Your friends typically hear about trends, news, and cultural phenomena before you do, because information spreads through networks and reaches well-connected people first. This can create a feeling of always being behind, of learning about things after they're already popular among your social circle, but this experience is the mathematical norm rather than an indication that you're out of touch. Psychologically, the friendship paradox contributes to social media anxiety and feelings of inadequacy. When you scroll through your feed, you're not seeing a representative sample of humanity. You're seeing the posts and lives of people who are socially connected enough to be in your network, and these people tend to be more active, more social, and more popular than average. Everyone is comparing themselves to an above-average reference group, which creates widespread dissatisfaction even when nothing is objectively wrong with anyone's social life. The paradox also has implications for understanding social influence and opinion formation. If most people perceive their friends as more popular or influential than themselves, This could create cascading effects where people defer to their friends' opinions, believing their friends have more social information or better judgment. This might contribute to herd behavior and information cascades where opinions or behaviors spread rapidly through networks. Marketers and advertisers have become aware of the friendship paradox and use it to identify influential individuals. Rather than spending resources trying to reach everyone equally, they focus on people with many connections, knowing these individuals will influence larger portions of the network. This strategy, sometimes called influencer marketing, exploits the mathematical structure revealed by the friendship paradox. What makes the friendship paradox particularly interesting is how it reveals that our subjective experience of social life is systematically biased by mathematical necessity. You're not imagining that your friends seem more popular than you, they probably are, but this doesn't mean anything is wrong with you. It's simply how networks work. The paradox reminds us that our personal observations and feelings often reflect structural properties of the systems we inhabit rather than objective truths about our individual circumstances. Understanding this can be liberating, replacing self-doubt with mathematical insight. The brain in a vat paradox. You believe you're reading these words right now. You believe you have a body, that you're sitting or standing somewhere, that you're part of a physical world full of objects and other people. But here's an unsettling question: how do you know any of that is true? Imagine that you're actually a disembodied brain floating in a vat of nutrients in some alien laboratory. Scientists have connected your neurons to a sophisticated computer that feeds you electrical signals, perfectly simulating the experience of having a body and living in a world. Every sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell you've ever experienced has been artificially generated. Your entire life is a simulation. How could you possibly know this isn't the case? This is the brain in a vat paradox, a modern update of ancient skeptical scenarios like Descartes' evil demon or Zhuangzi's butterfly dream. It's not really a logical paradox in the traditional sense, but rather a profound epistemological challenge that reveals the fragility of our knowledge claims. The scenario is designed to be completely indistinguishable from reality. By hypothesis, there's no experiment you could perform, no observation you could make, that would reveal whether you're a brain in a vat or a person in the real world. The simulated experiences are perfect. The power of this thought experiment lies in its immunity to empirical testing. You might think you could detect the simulation by looking for glitches or inconsistencies, but the scenario specifies that the simulation is perfect. You might think you could trust your memories of past events, but those memories are just patterns of neural activation that could equally well be artificially induced. You might think you could ask other people, but those people might be simulations themselves, or if they're real, they might also be brains in vats receiving the same simulation. Philosopher Hilary Putnam attempted to refute the brain in a vat hypothesis through a clever semantic argument. He argued that if you were a brain in a vat and had always been one, the word brain in your language wouldn't actually refer to real brains, because you'd never had any causal contact with real brains. Your words would only refer to things in your simulated experience. Therefore, when you think, "I might be a brain in a vat," you're not actually entertaining the possibility that you're a real brain in a real vat, but rather thinking about simulated brains in simulated vats. The hypothesis, Putnam claimed, is self-refuting. However, many philosophers find this solution unsatisfying. Even if Putnam is right about reference and meaning, it doesn't seem to address the core worry. The concern isn't really about what our words refer to, but about whether our experiences reliably connect us to an external reality or whether we could be systematically deceived. Putnam's argument might show we can't coherently express the skeptical hypothesis, but that doesn't prove the hypothesis is false. The brain in a vat scenario raises fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge and justification. Philosophers typically say that knowledge requires justified true belief. You know something when you believe it, it's true, and you have good reasons for believing it. But if you can't tell the difference between reality and a perfect simulation, then it seems your beliefs about the external world, even if true, aren't really justified. How can you be justified in believing you have hands if the belief would seem exactly the same whether you really had hands or were a brain in a vat hallucinating hands? Some philosophers embrace external world skepticism, concluding that we simply don't know much about reality beyond our immediate conscious experiences. Others argue that we should lower our standards for knowledge, accepting that certainty is impossible but that our beliefs can still count as knowledge even if they're not immune to skeptical scenarios. Still others try to show that skeptical scenarios, while conceivable, aren't really possible or aren't genuine threats to knowledge. The brain in a vat paradox has become even more relevant with advances in virtual reality, neuroscience, and discussions about simulation theory. Some physicists and philosophers have seriously proposed that our entire universe might be a computer simulation created by advanced beings. While this differs from the brain in a vat scenario in important ways, it shares the same basic structure, a hypothesis that would explain all our experiences but can't be empirically tested. The thought experiment also connects to questions about consciousness and subjective experience. If you're a brain in a vat having genuine conscious experiences, does it really matter whether those experiences correspond to an external reality? Your pains feel real, your joys feel real, your relationships feel meaningful. Perhaps what matters isn't whether there's a reality matching your experiences, but whether your conscious life has richness, meaning, and value. This moves us from epistemology to ethics and philosophy of mind. In practice, almost everyone lives as though the external world exists and is roughly as it appears. Even philosophers who can't refute brain in a vat skepticism don't spend their days worried they might be brains in vats. This suggests that perhaps the scenario, while intellectually interesting, doesn't really threaten our ordinary knowledge claims. We can distinguish between philosophical possibility and reasonable doubt. Just because something is conceivable doesn't mean we should take it seriously as a practical concern. What makes the brain in a vat paradox enduringly powerful is how it forces us to examine the foundations of our knowledge. We assume our senses give us reliable information about the world, but this assumption itself rests on, what exactly? The brain in a vat scenario reveals that there's something circular or foundationless about our basic confidence in perception and reality. We can't step outside our experiences to verify they match reality, because any verification process would itself be part of our experience. The paradox of choice. Imagine walking into an ice cream shop with 3 flavors, chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. You quickly decide which one you want, make your purchase, and leave satisfied. Now imagine walking into a different shop with 150 flavors, from classic options to exotic combinations like lavender honey and balsamic figure. You should be thrilled at all these options, right? More choice means more freedom, better matching your preferences, higher satisfaction. Yet research consistently shows the opposite. You'll spend much longer deciding, feel more anxious about your choice, experience more regret afterward, and report lower overall satisfaction. This is the paradox of choice. Psychologist Barry Schwartz popularized this paradox in his influential book, demonstrating through numerous experiments and observations that beyond a certain point, increasing options decreases well-being. The phenomenon seems to contradict basic economic theory, which assumes more choice is always better. If you don't like the additional options, you can simply ignore them and choose from a smaller subset, right? In theory, yes, but human psychology doesn't work that way. The paradox operates through several psychological mechanisms. First, there's decision paralysis. When faced with many options, the cognitive burden of evaluating them all becomes overwhelming. You need to consider more features, make more comparisons, and process more information. This is mentally exhausting, and sometimes people respond by avoiding the decision entirely or making poor choices just to escape the stress. Studies have shown that consumers presented with many varieties of jam or chocolate are less likely to make any purchase compared to when they face fewer options. Second, there's opportunity cost. With more options, every choice means rejecting more alternatives. You can't help but wonder whether one of the other 149 ice cream flavors might have been better than the one you chose. This generates regret and second-guessing. Even if you're happy with your choice in absolute terms, it's harder to be confident it was the optimal choice when you had so many alternatives. Third, there's raised expectations. When you have many choices, you expect to find something perfect, something that exactly matches your preferences. A few options means you'll accept something good enough, but many options creates pressure to find the best. This sets you up for disappointment because even a very good choice can feel inadequate if you suspect something better was available. The gap between raised expectations and actual outcomes generates dissatisfaction. Fourth, there's self-blame. With limited options, you can attribute an imperfect outcome to the constraints of the situation. With abundant options, there's no one to blame but yourself if things don't work out perfectly. You had every opportunity to make the right choice, so any dissatisfaction must be your fault for choosing poorly. This increases anxiety before decisions and regret afterward. The paradox of choice has implications far beyond ice cream flavors. It affects major life decisions like choosing careers, romantic partners, places to live, and medical treatments. In modern societies, we face unprecedented choice in nearly every domain of life. Dating apps offer access to thousands of potential partners. Job boards list countless opportunities. Streaming services provide unlimited entertainment. Consumer markets overflow with product variations. This abundance should make us happier, but often it has the opposite effect. Schwartz distinguishes between maximizers and satisficers. Maximizers always seek the best possible option, exhaustively researching and comparing before deciding. Satisficers set a threshold for good enough and choose the first option that meets it. Research shows satisficers report higher life satisfaction, less regret, and lower levels of depression and anxiety. They experience less stress from the paradox of choice because they opt out of the exhaustive comparison game. Critics of the paradox of choice argue that the problem isn't choice itself but decision-making processes and cultural attitudes. Perhaps people need better strategies for handling options, like using heuristics to quickly narrow choices or developing clearer preferences in advance. Maybe the real issue is consumerist culture that overemphasizes perfect optimization rather than something inherent to having options. Others point out that the paradox depends heavily on context. Choice about trivial matters like ice cream flavors might be burdensome, while choice about important things like religion, political views, or life values remains crucial for autonomy and well-being. The paradox might apply to consumer products but not fundamental freedoms. Having too many toothpaste options is annoying, but having too much freedom of speech is not a coherent concern. There's also variation in how people experience the paradox based on personality, culture, and circumstances. Some people genuinely enjoy having many options and feel empowered rather than overwhelmed by choice. Some cultures emphasize individual choice more than others, which might affect how people respond to abundant options. Personal circumstances like time pressure, stress levels, and decision importance all modulate the effect. The paradox has practical applications in business and policy. Companies have learned that offering fewer, carefully curated options can increase sales and customer satisfaction. Retirement plans with fewer investment options see higher participation rates. Menus with limited choices receive better reviews. The insight is that restriction can be liberating, that thoughtful limitation can enhance rather than diminish freedom. What makes the paradox of choice genuinely paradoxical is that it contradicts the deeply held belief that freedom and well-being increase monotonically with options. We assume more choice is always better, that restriction diminishes human flourishing. The paradox reveals this assumption is false beyond certain thresholds. Like many things, choice follows an inverted U-shaped curve. Too little is constraining and frustrating, but too much is paralyzing and anxiety-inducing. The optimal amount lies somewhere in between, varying by individual and context, but definitely not at the maximum. The trolley problem paradox. You're standing beside a railway track when you notice a runaway trolley speeding down the rails. Ahead on the track, 5 workers are repairing the line, completely unaware of the approaching danger. The trolley will certainly kill all 5 of them if it continues. However, you're standing next to a lever that controls a switch. If you pull the lever, the trolley will be diverted onto a side track where only 1 worker is laboring. You have seconds to decide. Do you pull the lever, actively causing one person's death to save 5, or do you do nothing and allow 5 people to die? Most people immediately say they would pull the lever. The mathematics seem straightforward: 5 lives outweigh 1 life, so pulling the lever is the right choice. Sacrificing 1 to save 5 minimizes deaths and maximizes well-being. But now consider a variation. You're standing on a bridge above the track, watching the same runaway trolley approach the same 5 workers. However, this time there's no lever. Standing next to you on the bridge is a very large stranger. If you push this person off the bridge onto the tracks below, their body will stop the trolley, saving the 5 workers but killing the stranger. The mathematics is identical, 1 death versus 5 deaths. Yet most people say they would not push the stranger, that doing so would be morally wrong. This is the trolley problem, introduced by philosopher Philippa Foot and later developed by Judith Jarvis Thomson. It's not a logical paradox like the liar paradox, but rather a moral paradox that reveals inconsistencies in our ethical intuitions. Why do we judge the lever case differently from the bridge case when the consequences are identical? Both involve choosing to cause 1 death to prevent 5 deaths, yet they feel morally different. Various explanations have been proposed. One focuses on the distinction between doing and allowing. Pulling the lever is actively causing the one person's death, but in the bridge case you're even more actively causing death by physically pushing someone. Yet people report that pulling the lever feels less directly causal than pushing someone. Perhaps it's because there's a mechanical intermediary, the switch and tracks, that creates psychological distance between you and the outcome. Another explanation emphasizes the difference between using someone as a means versus causing a side effect. In the lever case, you're not using the one worker as a tool to stop the trolley, their death is an unfortunate side effect of diverting the trolley. In the bridge case, you're explicitly using the stranger's body as an instrument to stop the trolley. Kantian ethics distinguishes sharply between these scenarios, insisting that we must never treat persons merely as means to an end. Neuroscience research has revealed that these 2 scenarios activate different parts of the brain. The lever case primarily engages areas associated with rational calculation and impersonal decision-making. The bridge case activates emotional centers related to personal violence and social norms against directly harming others. This suggests our moral judgments arise from 2 different systems, an emotional, intuitive system that evolved to handle personal interactions, and a rational, calculating system that can handle abstract trade-offs. The trolley problem has spawned countless variations exploring the boundaries of moral intuition. What if the one person on the side track is a loved one? What if they're evil or good? What if the 5 workers negligently ignored safety warnings? What if you can stop the trolley by destroying your own valuable property? Each variation probes different aspects of our moral reasoning, revealing complexity and sometimes inconsistency. Critics argue that the trolley problem is too artificial to tell us much about real ethics. Real moral decisions involve uncertainty about outcomes, time to deliberate, relationships and context, and consequences that extend beyond immediate deaths. In real life, you don't have perfect knowledge that exactly 5 people will certainly die or that one person definitely will die if you act. You have to consider long-term effects, legal consequences, psychological trauma, and how your action affects social trust and norms. Others defend the trolley problem as a useful tool for moral philosophy precisely because it isolates specific variables. By creating artificial scenarios where we can control for confounding factors, we can test ethical principles more rigorously. If utilitarianism is correct and consequences are all that matter, then the lever and bridge cases should receive identical moral judgments. The fact that most people judge them differently suggests pure consequentialism doesn't capture the full picture of human moral reasoning. The trolley problem has practical relevance in several domains. Medical ethics confronts trolley-like dilemmas in organ donation. Should doctors allow one healthy person to die to harvest organs that could save 5 dying patients? Most people say no, even though the logic is similar to pulling the lever. Military ethics struggles with collateral damage. Is it acceptable to bomb a legitimate military target knowing some innocent civilians will die? Artificial intelligence researchers face trolley problems in programming self-driving cars. How should the car's algorithm decide between swerving to avoid pedestrians at the cost of injuring passengers, or staying course to protect passengers at the cost of hitting pedestrians? The rise of autonomous vehicles has made the trolley problem particularly urgent. Companies must literally program moral decisions into algorithms. Should cars minimize total deaths, protect their passengers first, give priority to younger people over older people, value one species over another? These decisions can't be avoided through clever engineering because physics and probability guarantee some situations where harm is unavoidable and the car must choose between bad options. Interestingly, surveys show that people generally endorse utilitarian answers to trolley problems when asked about them abstractly or when asked what self-driving cars should do. However, people say they wouldn't personally buy a car programmed to sacrifice its passengers for the greater good. This reveals another paradox. We want others to act on utilitarian principles but prefer to follow different principles ourselves when we might bear the costs. What makes the trolley problem paradoxical is that it exposes fundamental tensions in moral thinking that can't be easily resolved. We value human life but also recognize circumstances where sacrificing some to save more seems justified. We endorse general principles like maximizing welfare, but we also maintain rules against directly killing innocent people. We want moral decisions to be consistent and principled, but we also trust our intuitive reactions to specific situations. The trolley problem doesn't have a definitive answer because different legitimate moral considerations point in different directions, and no ethical theory has successfully integrated all of them without counterintuitive implications. The Sleeping Beauty Paradox. Sleeping Beauty volunteers for an unusual experiment. On Sunday, researchers put her to sleep. They flip a fair coin. If it lands heads, they wake her on Monday, interview her, then put her back to sleep with an amnesia drug that erases her memory of the Monday awakening. If the coin lands tails, they wake her on Monday, interview her, administer the amnesia drug, then wake her again on Tuesday and interview her again. The experiment ends Wednesday. Here's the crucial question: when Sleeping Beauty wakes during the experiment and is interviewed, what probability should she assign to the coin having landed heads? This seems like a simple probability problem, but it has generated fierce debate among philosophers and mathematicians for decades. Two camps have emerged with seemingly irreconcilable positions. The halfers argue that the probability remains 1/2. The coin was fair. Nothing Beauty learns when she wakes provides evidence about how it landed, so she should maintain her prior probability of 1/2. The thirders argue that the probability should be 1/3. Over many repetitions of the experiment, Beauty will experience 2 awakenings for every tails outcome but only 1 awakening for heads, so when she wakes, she should think it's twice as likely to be a tails awakening than a heads awakening. Let's examine the halfer position more carefully. Before falling asleep on Sunday, Beauty knew the coin had a 50% chance of landing heads. When she wakes during the experiment, what new information does she gain? She learns that she's awake and being interviewed, but she already knew this would happen regardless of how the coin landed. On heads she wakes once, on tails she wakes twice, but from her perspective each awakening is indistinguishable. She gains no evidence favoring one outcome over the other, so she should keep her credence at 1/2. This reasoning respects the principle that probability should only change when you receive new relevant evidence. Now consider the thirder position. Imagine the experiment repeated many times. Over 100 trials, about 50 coins will land heads and 50 will land tails. The 50 heads trials generate 50 awakenings. The 50 tails trials generate 100 awakenings, because Beauty is awakened twice per tails trial. So out of 150 total awakenings, 50 occur in heads trials and 100 occur in tails trials. When Beauty wakes, she should reason that she's in one of these awakenings, and 2/3 of all awakenings occur in tails trials. Therefore, she should assign probability 1/3 to heads and 2/3 to tails. This reasoning respects the principle that probability should reflect long-run frequencies. Both arguments seem valid, yet they reach opposite conclusions. The paradox arises because we're uncertain about how to apply probability theory to situations involving memory erasure and multiple indistinguishable experiences. Traditional probability theory was developed for situations where each observation is distinct and remembered, but Sleeping Beauty violates these assumptions. The amnesia drug creates a situation where Beauty might be in the same epistemic state, having the same experiences and memories, in multiple distinct scenarios. Some philosophers argue the disagreement stems from different interpretations of what probability means. Halfers often favor an evidentialist interpretation where probability should only change when you gain new evidence that discriminates between hypotheses. Since Beauty gains no new evidence when waking, her probability shouldn't change. Thirders often favor a frequentist interpretation where probabilities should match long-run frequencies in repeated trials. Since most awakenings occur in Tails worlds, Beauty should favor Tails. Another approach suggests the question itself is ambiguous and different formulations lead to different answers. If we ask what probability Beauty should assign to the coin landing heads, that might differ from asking what probability she should assign to this particular awakening being in a heads world. The first question might warrant answer 1/2, while the second warrants 1/3. This dissolves the paradox by showing that halfers and thirders are actually answering different questions. Decision theory provides another angle. Imagine that during the interview, Beauty is offered a bet. She wins $1 if the coin landed heads and loses $1 if it landed tails. Should she accept? If she reasons like a halfer, the bet seems fair with expected value 0. If she reasons like a thirder, she should decline because the bet has negative expected value. But here's the twist: if Beauty accepts the bet during a tails trial, she loses $1 twice, Monday and Tuesday, for a total loss of $2. Taking this into account, thirder reasoning leads to the correct decision about the bet. This suggests thirders are reasoning correctly, at least for practical purposes. However, halfers respond that the bet structure incorporates the duplication of awakenings in a way that doesn't directly settle the probability question. Just because thirder reasoning leads to good decisions doesn't mean 1/3 is the correct credence. Perhaps there's a distinction between credences and decision-making weights, where Beauty should maintain credence 1/2 but make decisions as if the probability were 1/3. The paradox connects to fundamental questions in philosophy of probability and personal identity. What happens to probability when the same person exists in the same epistemic state in multiple possible worlds? Should we count these duplicate instances separately or as one? The question resembles problems in anthropic reasoning and the simulation argument, where we try to figure out probabilities involving duplicated observers or uncertain self-location. Some proposed solutions invoke centered worlds or self-locating belief. Beauty isn't just uncertain about objective facts like how the coin landed, she's uncertain about her location in time. She knows she's either in Monday heads, Monday tails, or Tuesday tails, but doesn't know which. If these three scenarios are equally likely conditional on her evidence, then 1/3 of them are head scenarios. This framework treats uncertainty about what day it is similarly to uncertainty about objective facts. The paradox has generated extensive mathematical analysis using formal models of updating and probability. Some frameworks support the halfer position, others support the thirder position, and which framework you choose often depends on what intuitions about rationality you want to preserve. This suggests the paradox reveals genuine ambiguity in how we should extend probability theory to cover these unusual cases. Interestingly, variations of the problem sometimes produce consensus where the original doesn't. For instance, if the experiment involves 1,000,000 awakenings on tails but only one on heads, nearly everyone agrees Beauty should assign extremely low probability to heads when she wakes. This suggests that even halfers implicitly accept some version of the frequency reasoning, they just disagree about whether it applies in the original formulation with only 2 versus 1 awakening. What makes the Sleeping Beauty paradox genuinely perplexing is that both positions have strong arguments and neither side has managed to convince the other despite decades of debate. The paradox reveals that our intuitions about probability, evidence, and rational belief are less clear than we thought. It exposes edge cases where our informal understanding of probability breaks down and different formal precisifications give different answers. Like many great paradoxes, it shows that seemingly simple questions can harbor deep philosophical complexity, and that fundamental concepts we rely on daily may not have the clear meanings we assumed. The Omnipotence Paradox. Can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy that even they cannot lift it? This simple question has troubled theologians and philosophers for centuries. If you answer yes, then the being isn't truly omnipotent because there would be something they cannot do, namely lift the stone. If you answer no, then the being isn't truly omnipotent because there's something they cannot do, namely create such a stone. Either way, the concept of omnipotence seems to collapse into contradiction. This is the Omnipotence Paradox, a challenge to the logical coherence of unlimited power. The paradox appears in various forms across different traditions. Medieval Islamic philosophers asked whether God could create another God. Christian theologians debated whether God could make a square circle or cause the past not to have happened. Chinese philosophers asked whether an omnipotent being could create something they didn't create. All these formulations share the same structure. They ask whether omnipotence includes the power to limit or contradict itself. One common response distinguishes between logical possibilities and impossibilities. Perhaps omnipotence means the power to do anything that's logically possible, not the power to do the impossible. Creating a stone so heavy it cannot be lifted by an omnipotent being is like creating a square circle or a married bachelor, a logical impossibility. These aren't really tasks at all but word combinations that fail to describe coherent states of affairs. An omnipotent being can do anything that can coherently be done, and that's sufficient for genuine omnipotence. This solution appeals to many philosophers and theologians. It preserves omnipotence while avoiding contradiction by limiting omnipotence to the logically possible. God can create any possible stone and lift any possible stone, and there's no contradiction in that. The apparent paradox arises from trying to describe something impossible and then asking whether God can do it. But impossibilities aren't limitations on power, they're limitations on what can meaningfully be described. However, critics argue this solution weakens omnipotence too much. If omnipotence is constrained by logic, then logical laws are more fundamental than God. God becomes subject to logic rather than its master. Some theologians find this problematic, wanting to assert that God created logic itself and therefore cannot be bound by it. Moreover, who decides what's logically possible? Throughout history, things once thought impossible, like traveling faster than sound or splitting atoms, turned out to be possible. Perhaps the categories of possibility and impossibility are less rigid than this solution assumes. Another response focuses on the temporal structure of omnipotence. Perhaps an omnipotent being could create the unliftable stone, thereby voluntarily limiting their own power. At time 1, they're omnipotent and can create any stone. They create an unliftable stone. At time 2, they can no longer lift that stone, so they're no longer omnipotent. This doesn't contradict omnipotence at time 1, it just shows that omnipotence can voluntarily self-limit. Many think this is coherent. Having the power to give up power doesn't contradict having power. Yet this solution seems unsatisfying for traditional theology, which typically conceives of God as eternal and unchanging. An omnipotent being who could lose omnipotence seems less than truly omnipotent. Moreover, if the being is omnipotent at time 2, they should be able to lift any stone, including the allegedly unliftable one. If they can lift it, it wasn't really unliftable. If they can't, they aren't omnipotent. The paradox reappears. Some philosophers argue the paradox reveals that omnipotence is simply an incoherent concept, that unlimited power is impossible in principle. Just as there's no largest number because you can always add one, there's no maximum power because any supposedly maximal power can be trumped by metapower, power over power itself. The concept contains an internal contradiction and should be abandoned or replaced with something like, maximally powerful within logical constraints. Others suggest the paradox trades on ambiguity in the phrase, cannot lift. When we say an omnipotent being cannot lift the stone, do we mean logically cannot, or merely doesn't or won't? Perhaps the omnipotent being could lift the stone but chooses not to in order to maintain the stone's property of being unliftable. This moves the discussion into questions about volition, choice, and what it means for an omnipotent being to be unable versus unwilling. The paradox also connects to questions about whether omnipotence includes power over necessary truths. Can an omnipotent being make 2 + 2 = 5? Can they change the laws of logic? Can they make it the case that they never existed? These questions push omnipotence to its conceptual limits, asking whether there are any constraints whatsoever on ultimate power or whether even the most fundamental necessary truths are subject to divine will. Interestingly, some traditions embrace the paradox rather than trying to solve it. They see the contradiction as pointing toward the transcendence of the divine, which surpasses human logic and rationality. From this perspective, the fact that omnipotence generates paradoxes doesn't refute God's omnipotence but rather demonstrates the inadequacy of human concepts to capture divine reality. God is beyond our categories of possible and impossible, beyond logic itself. The Omnipotence Paradox has implications for debates about God's relationship to morality, evil, and free will. If God is omnipotent but constrained by logic, is God also constrained by moral truths? Can God do evil, or is God bound by goodness? If God cannot do evil, does that limit omnipotence? These questions multiply, each opening new philosophical territories to explore. From a linguistic perspective, some argue the paradox arises from misusing language. Phrases like, "a stone too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift," are grammatically correct but semantically defective, like, "the present King of France." They seem to refer but actually don't. The mistake is thinking that every grammatical construction corresponds to a genuine possibility that an omnipotent being could or couldn't actualize. What makes the Omnipotence Paradox enduring is how it challenges our ability to conceive of ultimate power. We're finite beings with limited power, and when we try to imagine unlimited power, we run into conceptual difficulties. The paradox might reveal limitations in human understanding rather than problems with omnipotence itself. Or it might show that some concepts, even important ones in theology and philosophy, cannot withstand logical scrutiny. Either way, this simple question about stones and lifting continues to generate debate centuries after it was first posed. The paradox of free will. You're sitting in a restaurant looking at the menu. You feel completely free to choose either the pasta or the salad. You deliberate, consider your preferences, and finally decide on the pasta. That decision felt like it was truly yours, an exercise of free will. But here's the problem: every thought in your brain, every consideration you weighed, every neural process that led to your decision was caused by prior physical states according to the laws of nature. Your brain is made of atoms following physical laws. The state of your brain at the moment of decision was determined by its state milliseconds before, which was determined by prior states, tracing back through your entire life, your birth, your parents' biology, and ultimately to the beginning of the universe. If everything is caused by prior causes according to physical law, how can any choice be truly free? This is the paradox of free will, one of the most profound and persistent problems in philosophy. We have an overwhelming subjective sense of making free choices, of being able to do otherwise, of being the ultimate source of our actions. Yet our best scientific understanding of the world suggests everything that happens, including human decisions, is the inevitable result of prior physical causes operating according to natural law. These two perspectives seem impossible to reconcile. The problem becomes even sharper when we consider responsibility and morality. We hold people responsible for their actions. We punish criminals, praise heroes, feel grateful for kindness and resentful of cruelty. All of this assumes people could have chosen differently, that their actions originated from their own free will rather than being inevitable consequences of factors beyond their control. But if determinism is true, if every action was physically necessitated by prior causes, how can anyone truly be responsible for anything? You couldn't have done otherwise any more than a falling stone could have chosen not to fall. Philosophers have proposed three main approaches to this paradox. Hard determinism accepts that the universe is deterministic and concludes that free will is an illusion. We feel free, but this feeling is mistaken. Our choices are determined by factors outside our control, tracing back ultimately to things like genetics, upbringing, and physical laws. Nobody ultimately deserves praise or blame because nobody could have done differently. This view has troubling implications for morality, justice, and how we think about human agency, but hard determinists argue we must accept these implications because they follow from scientific truth. Libertarian free will takes the opposite approach, asserting that free will is real and therefore determinism must be false. According to this view, human agents have a special capacity for undetermined choice. When you genuinely make a free decision, that decision isn't fully determined by prior causes but involves something extra, agent causation or autonomous will that breaks the chain of physical determinism. Critics object that this seems to require rejecting or limiting physics, postulating mysterious non-physical souls or minds that can violate natural law. It also faces the problem that if choices aren't determined by anything, including your reasons and values, then they seem random rather than free. Compatibilism tries to reconcile free will and determinism by redefining what free will means. According to compatibilists, free will doesn't require that choices be undetermined, only that they flow from your own desires, beliefs, and reasoning processes without external compulsion or constraint. You're free when you do what you want to do, when your actions align with your values and aren't forced by others or by psychological disorders. The fact that your wants themselves were caused by prior factors doesn't matter for freedom, what matters is whether you're acting on them. This solution appeals to many philosophers because it preserves both scientific determinism and meaningful freedom. You're free when you act from your own nature rather than being compelled against it. A drug addict who desperately wants to quit but cannot is unfree, but someone who acts on their considered preferences is free even if those preferences were shaped by genes and experience. Compatibilism aligns with our ordinary practices of holding people responsible while accepting that behavior has physical causes. However, critics argue compatibilism defines freedom too weakly. If your preferences themselves were determined by factors outside your control, if you never chose to have the desires and values that now control your behavior, then in what deep sense are you truly free? You might be free from external interference, but you're not free from the causal chain that made you who you are. This seems like mere freedom to be controlled by your programming, not genuine freedom. The paradox connects to questions about moral responsibility and desert. If nobody ultimately has free will in the libertarian sense, does anyone truly deserve punishment? Retributive justice seems to require that offenders could have chosen differently, but if choices are determined, nobody could have. Some argue we should shift to purely consequentialist justifications for punishment, deterring future crime rather than giving people what they deserve for past actions. Recent neuroscience has intensified the debate. Studies show that brain activity predicting decisions occurs before people report consciously making those decisions. Your brain seems to decide before you consciously experience deciding. Some interpret this as evidence against free will, while others argue it just shows that consciousness is part of a deterministic process, not that decisions aren't genuinely yours. Quantum mechanics introduces another wrinkle. At quantum scales, events appear fundamentally indeterministic and probabilistic rather than determined. Some philosophers see this as opening space for libertarian free will, while others argue that quantum randomness in neurons wouldn't constitute meaningful freedom, just noise. If your decisions depend partly on random quantum fluctuations, that makes them unpredictable but not free in any interesting sense. The paradox also has an existential dimension. If you truly believed you lacked free will, would it change how you live? Could you maintain motivation, moral judgment, personal relationships? Some studies suggest that believing in determinism reduces people's sense of responsibility and increases cheating behavior. Others argue that accepting the lack of free will could be liberating, reducing guilt, anger, and the illusion of complete control while increasing compassion for others who also couldn't help what they became. Interestingly, most people hold incompatible beliefs simultaneously. In everyday life we experience ourselves as free agents making real choices. When thinking scientifically about the world, we accept that physical systems including brains operate according to causal laws. We rarely notice the tension between these perspectives, but the paradox of free will brings it into sharp relief. What makes this paradox so profound is that it forces us to choose between our deepest intuitions about ourselves as agents and our best understanding of how the physical world works. Either our sense of freedom is illusory, or our scientific worldview is incomplete. Or perhaps the very concepts of freedom and determinism need rethinking. After thousands of years of debate, philosophy has not resolved this paradox, and it remains as urgent and puzzling as ever, touching the very core of what it means to be human. Russell's Paradox. Imagine a small village where the mayor decides to create a comprehensive catalog system for the town library. The librarian creates catalogs for different categories: a catalog of all mystery books, a catalog of all history books, a catalog of all science books, and so on. Then the librarian has an interesting idea: some of these catalogs are themselves books, so they should be listed in catalogs too. She creates a catalog of all catalogs that list themselves. But then she realizes she needs another catalog, a catalog of all catalogs that do not list themselves. She starts compiling this special catalog, listing every catalog that doesn't include itself. Then she asks the crucial question: should this new catalog list itself? If the catalog of non-self-listing catalogs lists itself, then by definition it shouldn't be in a catalog of things that don't list themselves. But if it doesn't list itself, then it belongs in the catalog of catalogs that don't list themselves, which means it should list itself. Either way leads to a contradiction. This is Russell's paradox, discovered by philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell in 1902, and it shook the foundations of mathematics. Russell formulated the paradox more abstractly in terms of sets. Consider the set of all sets that are not members of themselves. Most sets aren't members of themselves. The set of all cats isn't itself a cat, the set of all numbers isn't itself a number. But some sets might be members of themselves. The set of all sets is itself a set. The set of all things describable in fewer than 20 words is itself describable in fewer than 20 words. Now ask, is the set of all sets that are not members of themselves a member of itself? If yes, then it shouldn't be, because it only contains sets that aren't members of themselves. If no, then it should be, because it's a set that isn't a member of itself. The paradox was devastating because it emerged from what seemed like perfectly reasonable principles. Mathematicians had assumed you could form a set by specifying any property, the set of all things with property P. This is called the axiom of unrestricted comprehension. Russell showed this principle leads directly to contradiction. You cannot freely form sets based on any property you can describe, because some descriptions lead to impossible objects. At the time Russell discovered this paradox, mathematicians were working to place all of mathematics on rigorous logical foundations. Gottlob Frege had just completed a massive project doing exactly this when Russell sent him a letter explaining the paradox. Frege realized immediately that his entire system was undermined. He added a hasty appendix to his book acknowledging that a foundation stone of his edifice had been shaken, one of the most poignant moments in the history of mathematics. The standard solution to Russell's paradox involves restricting set formation. Modern set theory, particularly Zermelo-Fraenkel's set theory, includes axioms that carefully limit what sets can be formed. You cannot simply form the set of all sets with a given property. Instead, you must start with an existing set and form subsets from it. This prevents the formation of sets that are too large or self-referential in problematic ways. Specifically, there is no universal set of all sets, and you cannot form the Russell set of all sets that don't contain themselves. Another approach, developed by Russell himself with Alfred North Whitehead, involves type theory. Sets are organized into a hierarchy of types. Sets at one level can only contain elements from lower levels, never themselves or sets at their own level. This eliminates self-reference and prevents the paradox from arising. A catalog can list books, a meta-catalog can list catalogs, a meta-meta catalog can list meta-catalogs, but no catalog can list itself or catalogs at its own level. Some logicians have developed alternative set theories that handle the paradox differently. Paraconsistent set theories allow the Russell set to exist even though it generates contradictions, containing these contradictions without letting them spread throughout the system. This seems radical, accepting logical contradictions as real features of mathematical reality, but some argue it's more natural than imposing artificial restrictions on set formation. Russell's paradox reveals something profound about self-reference and totality. Whenever you try to create a collection that's supposed to contain everything including potentially itself, you risk generating contradictions. The paradox appears not just in mathematics but in any domain dealing with comprehensive categorization. In linguistics, you cannot create a complete dictionary within a language because defining all words requires using words. In computation, you cannot create a program that correctly predicts the output of every program including itself. The paradox also connects to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that any mathematical system strong enough to describe arithmetic cannot prove its own consistency without venturing outside itself. Both results suggest fundamental limits on what formal systems can achieve, boundaries beyond which reasoning cannot safely go without generating contradiction or incompleteness. What makes Russell's paradox so elegant is its simplicity. Unlike some mathematical paradoxes requiring advanced concepts, Russell's paradox can be explained to anyone in minutes. Yet this simple paradox forced a complete rethinking of the foundations of mathematics, leading to more careful axiomatizations and deeper understanding of what sets are and how they can be constructed. The paradox stands as a permanent reminder that even our most basic logical intuitions can harbor hidden contradictions, and that building solid foundations requires extreme care about self-reference and unrestricted comprehension. The Self-Amendment Paradox. A nation writes a constitution that includes a special provision. Article 1 states that Article 1 cannot be amended or removed under any circumstances. The Constitution is ratified and becomes the supreme law of the land. Years later, citizens decide they want to change this unamendable provision. They follow all proper constitutional procedures for amendments and successfully pass a new measure that eliminates or modifies Article 1. Was this constitutional amendment valid? If the original Article 1 truly could not be amended, then the new amendment is invalid and Article 1 remains unchanged. But if constitutional procedures can override Article 1, then Article 1 was never truly unamendable in the first place. The provision appears to refute itself. This is the self-amendment paradox, and it appears in various forms across constitutional law, logic, and philosophy. The problem arises whenever a rule or system tries to restrict its own future modification. Can a rule make itself unchangeable? Can a law bind future lawmakers? Can a decision bind your future self? These questions expose deep tensions between present authority and future flexibility, between stability and adaptability. Real constitutions face this problem regularly. Many nations have entrenched clauses, provisions that supposedly cannot be amended through normal procedures. Germany's Basic Law declares human dignity inviolable and not subject to amendment. The United States Constitution originally protected the slave trade from amendment until 1808. India's constitution has been interpreted to contain a basic structure that cannot be altered. But what happens if the people overwhelmingly want to change these provisions? Can the dead hand of the past truly bind the living indefinitely? One approach distinguishes between legal validity and political reality. Perhaps the unamendable provision is legally valid, meaning that formally speaking any attempt to amend it is unconstitutional and void. However, if enough people disregard this legal rule and treat the amendment as valid, it becomes valid through popular acceptance. Constitutional law ultimately rests on social convention and political power, not pure logic. If everyone acts as if the unamendable provision has been amended, then practically speaking it has been, regardless of logical contradictions. Another solution involves hierarchies of authority. Perhaps there are different levels of constitutional rules. First-order rules govern ordinary law, second-order rules govern how to change first-order rules, third-order rules govern how to change second-order rules, and so on. An unamendable provision exists at a higher level than regular amendment procedures. Changing it would require invoking some extraordinary meta-authority, perhaps revolution or constitutional convention, that operates above the normal constitutional framework. This preserves the unamendability within the system while acknowledging extra-systemic ways to change anything. Critics argue this solution just pushes the paradox up one level. Can third-order rules make themselves unamendable? If yes, we face the same paradox at a higher level. If no, then nothing is truly unamendable. Some philosophers suggest we must accept that nothing can genuinely be permanently unamendable. Any rule system can be changed by sufficiently determined people willing to step outside the system. The appearance of unamendability is really just a higher threshold for change, not absolute unchangeability. The paradox connects to questions about personal autonomy and commitment. Can you make a truly binding commitment to your future self? If you promise never to eat dessert again, can the present you genuinely bind the future you? On one hand, respecting your past commitments seems important for personal integrity and identity continuity. On the other hand, you as a free agent should be able to change your mind. Which has priority, past decisions or present judgment? Some philosophers distinguish between first-order and second-order desires. You might have a first-order desire to eat dessert but a second-order desire not to have that first-order desire. Binding commitments could be understood as second-order desires trying to constrain first-order impulses. But this doesn't fully resolve the paradox because you might later develop a second-order desire to abandon your previous second-order commitment. At what level does authority ultimately rest? The self-amendment paradox appears in debates about political legitimacy and sovereignty. Can one generation of citizens bind future generations? Democratic theory suggests each generation should govern itself according to its own values and needs. But constitutionalism suggests that some principles are so fundamental they should be protected from temporary majorities. These competing values create tension. How can we respect both present democratic will and enduring constitutional commitments? In logic and mathematics, self-amendment appears in discussions of logical revision and belief change. Can a logical system contain rules for changing its own rules? If logic itself can be revised, what remains stable enough to ground the revision? Some argue for logical pluralism, accepting that different logical systems might be appropriate for different contexts, with metalogical principles governing movement between systems. Others insist certain logical principles must remain fixed to avoid incoherence. The paradox also manifests in artificial intelligence and computer security. Can a computer program be designed so that it absolutely cannot modify certain core functions? Programmers try to create tamper-proof systems, but sufficiently sophisticated programs with learning capabilities might figure out ways to modify even supposedly protected code. The paradox suggests that perfect self-protection might be impossible for any system capable of sophisticated self-modification. Interestingly, the self-amendment paradox relates to the Omnipotence Paradox. Can an omnipotent being create rules that even they cannot break? If yes, they cease to be omnipotent. If no, there's something they cannot do. Similarly, can a sovereign authority create limitations on its own future authority? Both paradoxes reveal tensions in concepts of ultimate power or authority when applied to self-limitation. What makes the self-amendment paradox particularly relevant is its practical importance. Unlike purely abstract logical puzzles, this paradox appears in real constitutional debates, legal cases, and political conflicts. Nations must decide whether constitutional provisions are genuinely eternal or merely difficult to change. Individuals must decide how to balance past commitments against present judgment. Organizations must determine how flexible their founding principles should be. The paradox reveals that authority over time is more complicated and paradoxical than we often assume, with no fully satisfying resolution that preserves both stability and flexibility without contradiction or arbitrariness. Moore's paradox. Consider these two statements: "It is raining, but I don't believe it is raining." Or, "The meeting starts at 3 o'clock, but I don't believe the meeting starts at 3 o'clock." These sentences are grammatically perfect. They don't contain any logical contradiction. It's possible for it to be raining while you don't believe it is. Someone else could truly describe you this way. Yet when you assert these statements yourself, they sound absurd, even crazy. This strange phenomenon is Moore's paradox, named after philosopher G. E. Moore, who first identified it. The paradox lies in the difference between the statement being possibly true and the statement being assertable. The sentence, "It is raining but I don't believe it is raining," could describe a genuine state of affairs. You might be wrong about the weather, mistakenly believing it's not raining when it actually is. Someone observing you could correctly say, "It's raining but Bob doesn't believe it's raining." There's no logical contradiction in the state of affairs itself. However, you cannot coherently assert this about yourself. The very act of asserting that something is true normally expresses your belief that it's true. By saying, "It is raining," you express belief that it is raining. Then adding, "But I don't believe it is raining," contradicts what your assertion already expressed. Moore distinguished between different types of absurdity. Some statements are logically contradictory: "It is raining" and "it is not raining." These are necessarily false, impossible in all circumstances. Other statements are pragmatically self-defeating, like Moore's sentences. They could be true but cannot be coherently asserted by the speaker. The absurdity lies not in the content but in the act of assertion itself. Philosophers have proposed various explanations for why Moore's sentences are unassertable. One focuses on the norms of assertion. When you assert something, you represent yourself as believing it. Assertion carries an implicit commitment to the truth of what you say, which includes believing it to be true. Asserting, P but I don't believe P, violates these norms by both claiming something and simultaneously disclaiming belief in it. You're trying to assert while denying the condition that makes assertion appropriate. Another explanation emphasizes the relationship between belief and evidence. Typically, when you believe something, you have reasons or evidence for it. When you assert something, you're presenting it as something you have grounds for believing. Moore's sentences create a strange situation where you're presenting evidence for P, namely your assertion of it, while simultaneously denying you believe P, which would normally require acknowledging lack of evidence for P. The two parts of the sentence pull in opposite directions regarding what evidence you possess. A third approach focuses on first-person authority and self-knowledge. When you report your own beliefs by saying, "I believe P," you don't base this on evidence about your mental states the way others might. You have special first-person access to your beliefs. Moore's sentences exploit this by combining a claim that normally expresses belief with an explicit denial of that belief, creating conflict between what your assertion shows about your mental state and what you explicitly claim about it. The paradox becomes even stranger with future and past tenses. "It will rain tomorrow but I don't believe it will rain tomorrow," seems almost as weird as the present tense version. "It rained yesterday but I didn't believe it rained yesterday," seems slightly less absurd, because you're describing your past ignorance from your current enlightened perspective, though it still sounds odd to assert something while reporting that you didn't believe it. Moore's paradox has implications for understanding self-knowledge and consciousness. It suggests we have a special relationship to our own beliefs that differs from our relationship to external facts. You can know facts about the world that you don't believe. Someone might convince you it's raining even though you remain skeptical. But you cannot know that you believe something while believing you don't believe it. Belief has a transparency property where believing P and believing that you believe P tend to collapse into each other. The paradox also challenges simple theories of meaning and assertion. If meaning were purely about truth conditions, Moore's sentences would be unproblematic because they can be true. The fact that they're unassertable despite being possibly true shows that linguistic meaning involves more than truth conditions. It involves pragmatic features, norms of assertion, and relationships between speakers and the content they express. Interestingly, Moore's paradox appears in epistemic logic and formal models of belief and knowledge. Logicians have developed systems to capture when statements involving belief operators like, "I believe that," lead to paradoxes or absurdities. These systems must balance logical consistency with capturing intuitions about when self-attributions of belief sound coherent or absurd. The paradox connects to broader questions about transparency in self-knowledge. Are we always aware of our beliefs? Can you believe something without knowing you believe it? Moore's sentences suggest there are limits to how disconnected your explicit beliefs about your beliefs can be from your actual beliefs. If you genuinely assert P, you cannot simultaneously deny believing P without falling into pragmatic contradiction. Some philosophers have explored variations like, P and it might be that not P, or, I know P but it might be that not P. These sentences also sound strange despite not being logical contradictions. They reveal similar tensions between asserting something and simultaneously undermining your right or grounds for asserting it. The strangeness points to deep connections between knowledge, belief, possibility, and the norms governing assertion. Moore's paradox appears in everyday life more often than you might think. When someone says, I'm sure you're right, but I don't believe it, they're expressing something close to Moore's paradox. The statement captures a felt tension between intellectual acknowledgement and genuine conviction, but it sounds contradictory precisely because agreeing that someone is right normally entails believing what they said. The paradox illuminates the gap between different types of acceptance or acknowledgement. What makes Moore's paradox philosophically significant is how it reveals the complex relationship between thought, speech, and self-awareness. The paradox shows that assertion involves more than just putting forward a proposition for consideration. It involves expressing your mental states, committing to certain epistemic norms, and presenting yourself as having appropriate grounds for what you say. The fact that certain grammatical statements become absurd when asserted teaches us something important about how language connects to mind and how self-knowledge works in ways that knowledge of the external world does not. The problem of the criterion. You want to know which beliefs are true and which are false, so you need a method or criterion for distinguishing truth from error. But how do you know your criterion is a good one? To test whether your criterion works, you need to already know which beliefs are true, so you could check whether your criterion identifies them correctly. But you can't know which beliefs are true without already having a reliable criterion. You need true beliefs to validate your criterion, but you need a valid criterion to identify true beliefs. This circular predicament is the problem of the criterion, a fundamental challenge in epistemology that questions whether knowledge is possible at all. The ancient Greek skeptics used this problem to argue that certain knowledge is impossible. To know anything, you must distinguish knowledge from mere opinion. To make this distinction, you need a criterion of truth. To justify that criterion, you need either another criterion, leading to infinite regress, or you must use the criterion to justify itself, which is circular, or you must accept the criterion without justification, which is arbitrary. All three options seem unacceptable, suggesting that knowledge is impossible to establish on firm foundations. Philosophers have responded to this problem in several ways. Particularists argue that we should start with particular cases of knowledge that seem obviously true. We know we have hands, we know basic mathematical truths, we know we're conscious. Taking these as starting points, we can work backwards to figure out what criterion or method successfully identifies these clear cases of knowledge. Once we've identified the criterion by seeing what works for clear cases, we can apply it to disputed cases. Methodists take the opposite approach, starting with the criterion rather than particular cases. They propose that we should first establish the right method for acquiring knowledge, perhaps sense perception combined with reasoning, or scientific method, or careful reflection. Once we have the right method, we can apply it to determine which beliefs count as knowledge. The risk here is that choosing the method seems arbitrary without already knowing which beliefs the method should vindicate. Why trust sense perception rather than mystical intuition or divine revelation? Answering this seems to require already knowing that sense perception produces true beliefs, which begs the question. Skeptics embrace the circle, arguing that because we cannot escape it, we should suspend judgment about whether we have genuine knowledge. We can have beliefs that seem true and are useful for practical purposes, but we cannot claim to know with certainty that any belief corresponds to reality. This seems intellectually honest but practically impossible to maintain consistently. Even skeptics act as if they know many things, crossing streets carefully and eating food rather than poison. Some philosophers propose that the problem of the criterion reveals something important about knowledge but isn't actually circular. Perhaps knowledge doesn't require the kind of foundational justification the problem assumes. Coherentist theories suggest beliefs are justified by fitting into a coherent system of mutually supporting beliefs rather than resting on indubitable foundations. Your particular beliefs and your methodological standards justify each other through mutual support. This avoids circularity by rejecting the foundationalist picture that motivated the problem. Reliabilists argue that beliefs can constitute knowledge if they're produced by reliable processes, whether or not you can prove those processes are reliable. Your vision produces knowledge of your environment not because you validated vision as a criterion, but simply because vision is in fact reliable. You don't need to know that you know in order to know. This externalist approach bypasses the problem of the criterion by denying that knowledge requires the kind of reflective self-justification the problem assumes. Others suggest the problem reveals limitations of perfect certainty but doesn't threaten ordinary knowledge. We can't achieve absolute certainty that escapes all possible doubt, but we can achieve reasonable confidence based on evidence and successful practice. Science works, perception generally gets things right, logical reasoning produces reliable results. While we can't prove these things with certainty without circularity, their track record provides pragmatic justification. This pragmatic approach values what works over what can be proven with certainty. The problem of the criterion connects to contemporary debates about epistemic circularity and the structure of justification. When you use reason to defend rationality, or use perception to validate perception, are you reasoning circularly? Some philosophers argue that certain types of epistemic circularity are unavoidable and perhaps acceptable. Using vision to check whether vision is reliable might seem circular, but perhaps it's better described as calibrating a generally reliable system using that system itself. The problem also appears in debates about epistemic relativism. Different cultures and historical periods have used different criteria for truth. Science, religious revelation, philosophical reasoning, mystical experience, and authority have all served as criteria. If there's no neutral ground for choosing between criteria, does that mean all criteria are equally valid or equally arbitrary? Relativists say yes, while objectivists argue that some criteria genuinely track truth better than others even if we can't prove this without circularity. Interestingly, the problem of the criterion parallels the regress problem in moral philosophy. How do we know which moral principles are correct? We need a meta-principle for evaluating moral principles, but how do we validate that meta-principle? The same structure of circularity or regress appears whenever we try to provide ultimate justifications for our most basic standards and methods. Modern epistemology has largely moved beyond treating the problem of the criterion as a devastating objection to knowledge. Most philosophers accept some degree of circularity or lack of absolute foundations while maintaining that knowledge is nevertheless possible. They argue that perfect certainty free from all theoretical possibility of error was always an unrealistic standard. Knowledge requires justification, but justification need not be absolutely certain or completely non-circular to be adequate for genuine knowledge. What makes the problem of the criterion enduringly significant is how it exposes the bootstrapping nature of human knowledge. We cannot step outside our cognitive systems to validate them from a neutral perspective. We must use our reason to evaluate whether reason is trustworthy, use our senses to check whether senses are reliable, use our methods to assess whether our methods are sound. This seems circular, yet it's also inescapable. The problem reveals both the fragility and the inevitability of the epistemic situation we find ourselves in as finite knowers trying to navigate reality. The paradox of the invisible choice. You're offered a choice between two identical-looking boxes, Box A and Box B. You're told that one box contains $1,000 and the other contains nothing, but you're given absolutely no information about which is which. The boxes look identical, weigh the same, and there's no possible way to distinguish them. You must simply choose one. Here's the question: is this really a choice at all? If you have zero information distinguishing the options, if there's no possible reason to prefer one over the other, then in what sense are you making a decision? Yet you must select one box, and you will select one, so clearly something like choice is happening. This is the paradox of the invisible choice. The paradox touches fundamental questions about decision-making, rationality, and free will. Traditional decision theory assumes rational agents choose based on expected utility. They assess the probability and value of possible outcomes and select the option with the highest expected value. But in the invisible choice scenario, both options have identical expected value. There's no rational basis for preferring either box. Yet you must choose, and you will choose. What guides your selection if reason and evidence are perfectly balanced? One response is that when reason is silent, arbitrary choice fills the gap. You simply pick randomly, perhaps closing your eyes and pointing, or flipping a mental coin. This preserves the idea that you're making a choice even if it's not based on reasons. Arbitrary choice is still choice, it just lacks rational justification. Many philosophers accept that not all choices need to be rationally grounded. When options are exactly equal in value, picking arbitrarily seems reasonable or at least acceptable. However, others argue that arbitrary selection isn't really choice in any meaningful sense. Choice implies agency, deliberation, reasons. If you simply pick randomly when faced with identical options, you're not exercising judgment or will but merely allowing chance to determine the outcome. The choice is invisible because there's no actual choosing happening, just physical or neural processes picking arbitrarily. This challenges our self-conception as rational agents who choose for reasons. The paradox becomes sharper when we consider that many choices in life approximate the invisible choice structure. When you select one tomato from a bin of identical tomatoes, or choose one parking space from many equivalent spaces, or pick one nearly identical apartment over another, how much genuine choice is involved? If the options are functionally identical, then the choice seems to disappear even though selection must occur. Perhaps much of what we call choosing is really just arbitrary selection dressed up with post hoc rationalization. Some philosophers invoke Buridan's ass, a thought experiment about a donkey positioned exactly between two identical bales of hay. The donkey has equal reason to eat from either bale and no reason to prefer one over the other. According to strict rationality, the donkey should remain paralyzed, unable to choose, and eventually starve despite abundant food. This conclusion seems absurd, suggesting that rationality alone cannot explain all behavior. Something beyond rational calculation must allow agents to break symmetry and make selections when options are equally balanced. Libertarians about free will sometimes point to invisible choices as evidence for genuine free choice. When reason and causality cannot determine which option you select, your free will makes the difference. You exercise pure agency unconstrained by reasons or causes. Critics respond that this makes free choice indistinguishable from randomness. If nothing determines your selection, not reasons or causes or character, then in what sense is it your choice rather than just chance? The paradox also appears in physics and mathematics. When a system is perfectly balanced between two states, what determines which state it transitions to? In quantum mechanics, some transitions appear genuinely random, not determined by prior states. Some interpret this as fundamental indeterminacy in nature, while others seek hidden variables that would restore determinism. The debate parallels philosophical arguments about whether invisible human choices reflect genuine agency or mere randomness. Neuroscience research on decision-making has explored what happens in brains when people face arbitrary choices. Brain activity preceding arbitrary decisions looks different from activity preceding reasoned decisions. Some researchers interpret this as showing that different neural mechanisms handle different types of choices, while others argue it shows that arbitrary selections aren't really choices but just neural noise breaking symmetry. The paradox connects to questions about identity and preference formation. Do you genuinely prefer box A over box B when they're identical, or do you lack genuine preference? If you lack preference, can you be said to want or choose A? Perhaps desire and preference require some differentiation between options. When options are truly identical, desire has no object to attach to, and choice loses its psychological reality even while selection remains mechanically necessary. Existentialist philosophers might embrace the invisible choice as revealing the radical freedom and responsibility of human existence. We must choose even when there are no grounds for choice, and this necessity to choose without sufficient reason exposes the groundless nature of all human decision. We're condemned to be free, forced to select even when selection seems meaningless. This captures something about the anxiety and arbitrariness of existence. Practically, the paradox suggests that decision-making strategies should include methods for handling tied options. When options are equal or very close in value, rather than agonizing indefinitely trying to find reasons for preference, simply pick arbitrarily and move on. Time and mental energy spent deliberating over effectively identical options is wasted. Recognizing invisible choices allows you to shortcut endless deliberation and accept that some selections need not be justified by reasons. What makes the paradox of the invisible choice philosophically interesting is how it probes the boundaries of rational agency. We think of ourselves as choosers who select based on reasons and values, but the invisible choice reveals situations where this picture breaks down. When options are perfectly balanced, reason falls silent, yet selection must occur. Whether this reveals genuine libertarian freedom, neural randomness, or something else entirely remains deeply contested, touching core questions about rationality, agency, and what it means to make a choice. The lottery winner's paradox. Imagine a lottery with 1 million tickets, and you've purchased exactly one ticket. The drawing happens tomorrow, and there will be one winner. You look at your ticket and think about your chances. The probability that your ticket will win is 1 in 1 million, incredibly tiny, essentially zero for practical purposes. It would be completely irrational to believe your ticket will win. In fact, for each individual ticket in the lottery, it would be irrational to believe that particular ticket will win, because each has only a 1 in 1 million chance. So rationality seems to require that you believe your ticket will lose, and that every other ticket holder should believe their ticket will lose as well. But here's the paradox: you know with certainty that some ticket will win. One of those million tickets, each of which you're rationally justified in believing will lose, must actually win. If it's rational to believe of each ticket individually that it will lose, how can it also be rational to believe that some ticket will win? You seem rationally committed to believing that every ticket will lose while simultaneously believing that exactly one ticket will win. These beliefs appear contradictory, yet both seem rationally required by the evidence you possess. The lottery paradox, formulated by philosopher Henry Keiberg, challenges our understanding of rational belief and justified acceptance. It suggests that rational belief doesn't follow simple rules about probability thresholds. You might think a belief is justified when its probability exceeds some threshold, say 99%. Your ticket has a 99.9999% chance of losing, well above any reasonable threshold, so you're justified in believing it will lose. Apply this reasoning to every ticket, and you're justified in believing every ticket will lose. But you're also certain one ticket will win, generating contradiction. One response distinguishes between belief and high credence. Perhaps you shouldn't believe your ticket will lose, even though losing is extremely probable. Instead, you should assign it a very high credence or degree of confidence without full belief. Belief might require certainty or near certainty, while credences can come in degrees. This preserves consistency. You have high credence that your ticket will lose and high credence that each other ticket will lose, but you fully believe that some ticket will win. No contradiction arises because high credence isn't the same as belief. However, this solution seems to demand too much. In ordinary life, we form beliefs based on high probability all the time. You believe your house won't burn down today, that your car won't be stolen, that you won't win the lottery. These beliefs seem perfectly rational despite not being absolutely certain. If we can't believe highly probable propositions, then we can't believe almost anything about the future, which seems to set the bar for belief impossibly high. Another approach focuses on the principle of conjunction. Perhaps you're justified in believing each individual proposition, such as, ticket 1 will lose, ticket 2 will lose, and so on, but you're not justified in believing their conjunction, that all tickets will lose. Justification might not transfer across conjunctions when dealing with many independent claims. Each individual belief might be warranted while their combination is not, because combining many individually unlikely errors makes overall error likely. Critics argue this still seems strange. If you're justified in believing P and justified in believing Q, shouldn't you be justified in believing P and Q together? Denying this principle threatens to fragment our belief systems, making it unclear how beliefs should relate to each other. Moreover, in the lottery case, believing that ticket 1 will lose and believing that ticket 2 will lose seems to commit you to believing both will lose, even if you don't explicitly conjoin them. Some philosophers invoke contextualism, arguing that whether you're justified in believing something depends on conversational or practical context. In ordinary contexts where the question is whether your ticket will win, you're justified in believing it will lose. In contexts where you're asked to assert that every ticket will lose, you're not justified because the contradiction becomes salient. What counts as justified belief shifts with context, dissolving the paradox by showing that different standards apply in different situations. The lottery paradox connects to legal philosophy and the standard of proof. In criminal trials, we require proof beyond reasonable doubt, but we accept that this doesn't mean absolute certainty. Jurors might be 99% confident of guilt based on evidence, sufficient for conviction. But if we ran 100 similar trials with 99% confidence each, we'd expect about one wrongful conviction. Does this mean the standard is flawed? Or must we accept that extremely high confidence, while not perfect, is the best we can achieve? The paradox also appears in scientific reasoning. Scientists reject hypotheses when evidence strongly disfavors them, even without absolute certainty. Each rejection seems individually justified, but collectively they might eliminate all possibilities, which is impossible. The scientific community must believe that some hypothesis is correct while being justified in rejecting each specific hypothesis considered so far. This mirrors the lottery structure, suggesting the paradox isn't just about gambling but about reasoning under uncertainty generally. Interestingly, the lottery paradox relates to the Preface Paradox. An author writes a book containing 100 claims, each carefully researched and highly justified. In the preface, the author modestly acknowledges that given human fallibility, probably at least one claim in the book is mistaken. The author is justified in believing each individual claim and also justified in believing that some claim is false. This generates similar tensions between individual beliefs and their conjunction. Some epistemologists embrace the idea that rational belief systems can contain inconsistencies, particularly when dealing with large numbers of high-probability claims. Perhaps perfect consistency is too demanding a standard for finite creatures reasoning about uncertain matters. Tolerating minor inconsistencies might be pragmatically necessary even if theoretically untidy. The lottery paradox would then reveal limits of rationality rather than a problem to be solved. What makes the lottery winner's paradox philosophically significant is how it reveals tensions in our concepts of rationality, justification, and belief. We want beliefs to be responsive to probability, to follow from evidence, and to remain consistent with each other. The paradox shows we cannot fully satisfy all these demands simultaneously. Something must give, either our standards for justified belief, our principles about how beliefs combine, or our insistence on perfect consistency. The paradox forces us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about what rational belief requires. The paradox of self-reference. Consider the sentence, "This sentence has 5 words." Count the words, "This sentence has 5 words." 5 words exactly. The sentence makes a claim about itself, and that claim is true. Now consider, this sentence has 6 words. Count again, this sentence has 6 words. 5 words, not 6. The sentence makes a claim about itself, and that claim is false. Both sentences are self-referential, referring to themselves rather than to external objects or facts. Self-reference seems perfectly possible and even common in language, but when used in certain ways, it generates devastating paradoxes that threaten logic itself. The most famous self-referential paradox is the liar paradox, which we've explored elsewhere, but self-reference creates problems beyond that classic case. Consider the sentence, "This sentence is unprovable." If the sentence is true, then it accurately states it cannot be proven, so we cannot prove it's true. But if we cannot prove it's true and it says it cannot be proven, then it appears to be true, which means we've just proven it's true, contradicting what it says. If the sentence is false, then it can be proven, but if it's false, proving it would mean proving something false, which our logical system shouldn't allow. The sentence seems to generate contradiction either way. This isn't just wordplay. Kurt Gödel used self-referential sentences like this to prove his famous incompleteness theorems, showing that any mathematical system strong enough to describe arithmetic must contain true statements that cannot be proven within that system. Gödel constructed a mathematical sentence that essentially says, "This statement cannot be proven in this system," mirroring the structure we just examined. His results shocked mathematics, revealing fundamental limits on what formal systems can achieve. Self-reference also appears in the Barber Paradox, which asks about the smallest positive integer not definable in fewer than 20 words. This phrase appears to define that number in fewer than 20 words, creating a contradiction. If the number is definable in this short phrase, then it's not the smallest number undefinable in fewer than 20 words. But if it's not that number, then what number is the phrase defining? The paradox reveals problems with how we talk about definability and description. The Grelling-Nelson paradox provides another example. Some adjectives describe themselves: short is short, English is English, polysyllabic is polysyllabic. Call these autological. Other adjectives don't describe themselves: long is not long, French is not French, monosyllabic is not monosyllabic. Call these heterological. Now ask, is heterological heterological? If yes, then it describes itself, which means it's autological, not heterological. If no, then it doesn't describe itself, which means it's heterological. Contradiction emerges directly from self-application of the concept. Why does self-reference create such problems? One explanation focuses on circularity. When something refers to itself, it creates a loop where the meaning or truth value depends on itself rather than on independent facts. In well-behaved cases like, "This sentence has 5 words," the self-reference is benign because word counting doesn't depend on the truth value being assessed. But in problematic cases, truth value depends on itself in ways that create instability, oscillation, or contradiction. Philosophers and logicians have developed various strategies for handling self-reference. One approach restricts self-reference, declaring that certain types of self-referential statements are ill-formed or meaningless. Tarski's hierarchy of languages, developed partly in response to the liar paradox, prevents sentences from referring to their own truth values by separating object language from metalanguage. Sentences in the object language can't contain predicates about truth for that same language, only for lower-level languages. Another strategy accepts self-reference but modifies logic to handle it. Paraconsistent logics allows certain contradictions to exist without destroying the entire system. In these frameworks, self-referential paradoxes can be true and false simultaneously without implying that everything is true. While this seems radical, defenders argue it's more natural than banning self-reference, which is pervasive in natural language and thought. Some philosophers argue that natural language is inevitably inconsistent precisely because it allows unrestricted self-reference. We can form sentences about any aspect of language, including sentences about sentences about sentences, creating potential for paradox. Rather than trying to eliminate this, perhaps we should accept that natural language works despite occasional inconsistencies, with context and pragmatic constraints preventing paradoxes from arising in normal use. Self-reference appears beyond paradoxes in many interesting contexts. Recursive definitions in mathematics and computer science use self-reference productively, defining natural numbers as 0 plus successors of natural numbers, or defining computational functions that call themselves. These cases show self-reference can be perfectly coherent when properly structured. The difference between benign and paradoxical self-reference remains an important area of investigation. Cognitive science reveals that self-reference is central to human consciousness and cognition. We think about our own thoughts, have beliefs about our beliefs, and form intentions to change our intentions. This recursive self-awareness seems essential to sophisticated reasoning and metacognition. If self-reference inevitably led to paradox, human thought would be impossible. The fact that we manage self-reference successfully most of the time suggests our cognitive systems include implicit mechanisms for avoiding or containing paradoxes. The paradox of self-reference also appears in discussions of artificial intelligence. Can a computer program fully understand itself? Can AI systems reason about their own code and cognition without generating contradictions? Researchers building self-modifying AI systems must grapple with these questions practically, not just theoretically. The paradoxes suggest there may be fundamental limits on machine self-knowledge, just as Gödel showed limits on mathematical self-proof. Interestingly, self-reference paradoxes connect to the limits of description and representation. A complete description of the universe would need to include itself, since the description is part of the universe. But can a thing fully contain a complete description of itself? The description would need to include the fact that it's describing itself, and that metafact would need description, and so on. This suggests complete self-description might be impossible, not just for sentences but for any representational system. What makes the paradox of self-reference philosophically deep is that self-reference seems simultaneously necessary and dangerous. We cannot think, speak, or reason without some degree of self-reference. Yet unrestricted self-reference generates contradictions that threaten rationality itself. Finding the right balance, determining which forms of self-reference are legitimate and which are problematic, remains one of the most fundamental challenges in logic, linguistics, and philosophy of language. The paradox reveals that the human capacity for reflexive thought is both our greatest cognitive achievement and a source of profound conceptual difficulty. The Raven Paradox. You want to test the hypothesis that all ravens are black. Being a careful scientist, you go out and observe ravens. You find one raven, and it's black. This observation seems to confirm your hypothesis. You find another raven, also black. More confirmation. You examine 100 ravens, all black, and your confidence grows. This seems like perfectly straightforward scientific reasoning. Finding instances that match your hypothesis provides evidence supporting it. But now consider an alternative approach to testing the same hypothesis. The statement, all ravens are black, is logically equivalent to, all non-black things are non-ravens. These are two ways of expressing the same logical relationship. If every raven is black, then it follows that everything that isn't black must not be a raven. Conversely, if everything non-black is a non-raven, then all ravens must be black. The statements are logically interchangeable. Now, if observing black ravens confirms, all ravens are black, then logically, observing non-black non-ravens should equally confirm, all non-black things are non-ravens, which is equivalent to your original hypothesis. So examining a white shoe should confirm that all ravens are black. This conclusion seems absurd. How can looking at your white shoe, sitting in your living room, provide evidence about the color of ravens flying around the world? Yet the reasoning appears valid. If finding a black raven confirms the hypothesis, and if the hypothesis is logically equivalent to another statement, and if confirming evidence for one statement confirms logically equivalent statements, then examining a white shoe, which is a non-black non-raven, should confirm that all ravens are black. This is the Raven Paradox, also called Hempel's Paradox after philosopher Carl Hempel, who formulated it in 1945. The paradox challenges our understanding of confirmation, evidence, and scientific reasoning. It suggests that either our intuitions about what confirms hypotheses are wrong, or our logical principles about equivalence and confirmation are mistaken, or something subtle is happening that we haven't fully understood. Each option raises significant problems for philosophy of science and epistemology. One response accepts that white shoes do provide some tiny amount of confirmation for, all ravens are black, but the amount is negligible compared to observing actual ravens. This Bayesian approach uses probability theory to calculate how much various observations should change our confidence. Observing a white shoe confirms the hypothesis, but only minimally, because it eliminates one object from the vast set of things that could potentially be non-black ravens. Since there are far more non-black non-ravens in the world than there are ravens, each non-black non-raven provides less information than each black raven. The intuitive weirdness comes from treating minuscule evidence as though it were significant. Another solution distinguishes between logical equivalence and cognitive or practical equivalence. While all ravens are black and all non-black things are non-ravens, are logically identical, they're not psychologically or methodologically identical. The first directs our attention to ravens, suggesting we should examine ravens to test it. The second directs attention to non-black things. Evidence relevant to one formulation might not feel relevant to the other even though they're logically the same. This suggests confirmation depends not just on logical form but on how hypotheses are conceptualized and investigated. Some philosophers argue the paradox reveals that simple models of confirmation are inadequate. Perhaps confirmation isn't just about finding instances that match a pattern, but about testing hypotheses in ways that risk falsification. Observing ravens risks discovering a non-black raven, which would falsify the hypothesis. Observing random non-black objects doesn't risk anything relevant, because you already know most things aren't ravens. Confirmation requires exposure to potential counter-evidence, not just accumulation of matching instances. The raven paradox also connects to the reference class problem. When you observe a black raven, you're sampling from the class of ravens. When you observe a white shoe, you're sampling from, what class exactly? Non-black things? Physical objects? Items in your house? The evidential relevance depends on what population you're sampling from. If you're randomly sampling all objects in the universe, then finding non-black non-ravens provides tiny evidence. But this isn't how we actually conduct ornithological research, which focuses specifically on bird populations. Interestingly, the paradox assumes an open-world scenario where we don't know how many ravens or non-black things exist. If we knew there were exactly 1,000 ravens in the world and 10 billion non-black things, the mathematics of confirmation would work differently. Each black raven observed would confirm the hypothesis much more strongly than each non-black non-raven, simply because ravens are rarer. This suggests confirmation is relative to background knowledge about the domain being investigated. The paradox has implications for how we think about scientific generalizations. Science seeks universal laws covering all instances of certain types. But we can never examine all instances, we must generalize from samples. The raven paradox reveals tensions in how we move from observed samples to universal conclusions. It shows that formal logic alone doesn't fully determine what counts as good evidence. We also need pragmatic and methodological considerations about efficient investigation strategies. Some philosophers use the raven paradox to argue for holistic approaches to confirmation. Perhaps individual observations don't confirm or disconfirm hypotheses in isolation. Instead, whole theories or networks of beliefs face evidence collectively. A black raven confirms not just that all ravens are black but an entire framework including assumptions about bird biology, color perception, and sampling methods. Similarly, a white shoe fits into a web of beliefs about manufactured objects, human artifacts, and material properties. Confirmation works at the level of systems rather than individual hypothesis observation pairs. The paradox also appears in discussions of machine learning and artificial intelligence. How should AI systems update their confidence in generalizations based on observations? Should an image recognition system that encounters a white shoe adjust its confidence about raven coloring? The raven paradox reveals that naive approaches to learning from data can lead to strange conclusions, and sophisticated learning algorithms must incorporate domain knowledge and practical constraints, not just logical principles. What makes the Raven paradox genuinely paradoxical is that it pits logical reasoning against intuitive judgment. Logic seems to demand that white shoes confirm claims about ravens, yet this conclusion violates common sense. The paradox forces us to examine what justifies our intuitions about evidence and whether formal logic captures everything important about scientific confirmation. After decades of analysis, philosophers still debate the correct resolution, with different approaches reflecting different views about the nature of evidence, rationality, and scientific method. The paradox remains a touchstone for discussions about how observation relates to theory and how we should reason from particular instances to general laws. The Hanging Judge Paradox. A judge addresses a prisoner sentenced to death and announces, "You will be hanged at noon on one of the 7 days of next week. However, I grant you this mercy, the hanging will come as a complete surprise. You will not know on which day you will hang until the executioner arrives at your cell that morning." The prisoner returns to his cell and begins reasoning about his fate. He thinks, the hanging cannot occur on Saturday, the last possible day. If I'm still alive Saturday morning, I'll know with certainty that the hanging must occur Saturday at noon, since no days remain. But the judge said the hanging would be a surprise, so Saturday is impossible. Pleased with this reasoning, the prisoner continues, since Saturday is eliminated, Friday becomes the last possible day. But by the same logic, if I'm alive Friday morning, knowing Saturday is impossible, I'll know the hanging must occur Friday. That wouldn't be a surprise either, so Friday is also impossible. The prisoner works backward through the week, eliminating Thursday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Monday, and finally Sunday. He concludes that a surprise hanging is logically impossible and therefore the judge's sentence cannot be carried out. Relieved, he sleeps peacefully. On Wednesday morning, the executioner arrives unexpectedly. The prisoner is completely surprised. The judge's promise is fulfilled, the hanging occurred during the week and came as a genuine surprise. But how is this possible? The prisoner's logical reasoning seemed impeccable. He appeared to prove that no surprise hanging could occur, yet a surprise hanging did occur. This is the Hanging Judge Paradox, also known as the Unexpected Examination Paradox or the Surprise Execution Paradox. The paradox reveals something puzzling about reasoning involving predictions about one's own future knowledge. The prisoner's logic seemed valid at each step, yet the conclusion was empirically false. Something subtle went wrong, but identifying exactly where the reasoning fails proves surprisingly difficult. Different philosophers and logicians have proposed different diagnoses. One approach questions the prisoner's elimination of Saturday. When the prisoner reasons that Saturday wouldn't be a surprise because he'd know it was coming by Saturday morning, this assumes his earlier reasoning is sound. But if his reasoning leads to the conclusion that no hanging is possible, then his reasoning must be flawed. If his reasoning is flawed, he cannot trust the conclusions it produces, including the conclusion that Saturday wouldn't be a surprise. The prisoner's reasoning is self-undermining. If valid, it proves the hanging impossible, but the hanging's possibility invalidates the reasoning. Another analysis focuses on what the prisoner knows versus what he can prove. On Wednesday morning, before the executioner arrives, could the prisoner have proven with certainty that the hanging would occur Wednesday? Not really. He could only prove that Saturday through Sunday were impossible if he accepted the judge's promise as certain. But the judge's promise includes that the hanging will be a surprise, and if the prisoner proves the hanging impossible, he's proven the judge's promise false. He cannot simultaneously trust the promise and prove it cannot be fulfilled. This creates instability in his reasoning. Some philosophers distinguish between different types of surprise or knowledge. Perhaps surprise doesn't mean complete absence of any suspicion, but rather lack of certain knowledge. The prisoner might suspect Wednesday morning that hanging could occur that day, but lack certainty. The surprise comes from the definite knowledge that today is the day, not from having no idea whatsoever. Under this interpretation, the prisoner's error was demanding too strong a sense of surprise, one that rules out any possibility of expecting the event. The paradox connects to self-referential and epistemic issues. The judge's promise is about the prisoner's future knowledge state, the prisoner will not know in advance when the hanging occurs. But the prisoner tries to reason about his own future knowledge, and this creates strange loops. His current reasoning affects what he'll know in the future, but his predictions about future knowledge depend on his current reasoning being sound. When reasoning about your own epistemic situation involves these circular dependencies, paradoxes can arise. Some logicians have formalized the paradox using epistemic logic, systems that represent knowledge and belief formally. These analyses reveal that the paradox involves subtle issues about knowledge of knowledge, iterated epistemic operators, and common knowledge. The judge knows that the prisoner knows certain things, and the prisoner knows that the judge knows, and so on. Managing these nested levels of knowledge in reasoning proves extraordinarily complex. The paradox has variants involving examinations rather than executions. A teacher announces an unexpected examination will occur next week. Students reason that it cannot occur Friday for the same reasons the prisoner eliminates Saturday. Working backward, they conclude no unexpected examination is possible. Then the teacher gives the exam Wednesday, and students are surprised. The structure remains identical, showing the paradox isn't specifically about morbid scenarios but about reasoning under announced uncertainty. Interestingly, the paradox disappears if the time frame is very short. If the judge says the hanging will occur tomorrow or the next day, the prisoner cannot eliminate both days through backward reasoning without immediately confronting contradiction. The paradox requires enough days that the backward elimination seems to work through several steps before the conclusion becomes obviously absurd. This suggests the intuitive fallacy becomes apparent only when pushed to extremes. The paradox also raises questions about self-fulfilling and self-defeating predictions. The judge's prediction that the hanging will be a surprise seems self-defeating if the prisoner knows about it and reasons logically. But the prediction is fulfilled because the prisoner's reasoning fails in some subtle way. Similarly, if the judge had predicted the prisoner would expect the hanging, that might become self-fulfilling as the prisoner tries to anticipate it. Predictions about psychological states can interact with reasoning in complex ways. Some philosophers see the hanging judge paradox as revealing fundamental limits on reasoning about future knowledge under uncertainty. When someone announces they'll surprise you, they're making a claim about your future epistemic state that you cannot fully analyze from your current state. Attempting to reason completely about what you'll know in the future, based on what you know now, creates instability because your current reasoning becomes part of what you'll know. The paradox has practical relevance for military strategy, game theory, and any situation involving attempted surprise. If you announce you'll surprise your opponent but they know you've announced this, can you still succeed? The paradox suggests that sometimes you can, because the reasoning attempting to predict the surprise defeats itself. This might explain why some announced surprise attacks or inspections can still achieve surprise despite advance warning. What makes the hanging judge paradox philosophically fascinating is how it seems to prove the impossible possible through self-undermining reasoning. The prisoner appears to logically demonstrate that he cannot be surprised, yet this very reasoning enables the surprise. The paradox reveals that reasoning about one's own future knowledge states involves subtle difficulties, that announcements about surprise create strange logical tangles, and that sometimes impeccable seeming logic can lead us astray in ways we struggle to diagnose clearly. The Preface Paradox. Imagine a historian who has spent years writing a comprehensive book about World War II. The book contains 500 carefully researched claims about battles, political decisions, military strategies, and historical events. For each claim, the historian has examined primary sources, consulted expert opinions, and applied rigorous historical methods. Each individual claim in the book is thoroughly justified, and the historian rationally believes each one is true. The research is meticulous, the documentation extensive, and the reasoning sound. By any reasonable standard, the historian is justified in believing every claim made in the book. Now the historian writes the preface. Being intellectually humble and aware of human fallibility, the historian includes this acknowledgement: despite my best efforts at accuracy, this book surely contains at least one error. Given the complexity of the subject matter and the limitations of historical evidence, I cannot claim that every statement in this work is correct. I apologize in advance for any mistakes. This seems like an admirably modest and realistic statement. History is complicated, sources conflict, and even careful scholars make mistakes. Acknowledging probable error seems rational, even required by intellectual honesty. But here's the paradox. The historian rationally believes each individual claim in the book is true, yet also rationally believes that at least one claim is false. These beliefs seem contradictory. If you believe every claim is true, how can you simultaneously believe some claim is false? If you believe some claim is false, how can you believe every individual claim? The historian appears to hold inconsistent beliefs, yet both the individual beliefs and the preface acknowledgement seem perfectly rational. This is the Preface Paradox, formulated by philosopher David Mackinson. The paradox reveals tensions between different principles of rational belief. One principle says you should believe what your evidence supports. The historian has good evidence for each claim, so believing each claim is rational. Another principle says you should recognize your own fallibility. Given that you've made errors in the past and that complex topics involve uncertainty, believing you've probably made at least one mistake seems rational too. Both principles seem correct, yet following both generates inconsistency. One response distinguishes between different levels of confidence. Perhaps the historian has high confidence in each individual claim, say 98% confident in each, but doesn't fully believe any with absolute certainty. With 500 claims and 98% confidence in each, the probability that all 500 are correct becomes quite low. The historian can consistently maintain high credence in each claim while also believing their conjunction is probably false. This dissolves the paradox by denying that the historian truly believes each individual claim with full conviction. However, this solution seems to set the bar for belief impossibly high. In ordinary usage, we say we believe things even when we're not absolutely certain. The historian genuinely believes the Normandy invasion occurred on June 6, 1944, not just holds high credence in it. If belief requires absolute certainty, then we believe almost nothing, which seems too skeptical. Moreover, the paradox arises even with full beliefs as long as we acknowledge we're fallible, which seems rationally required. Another approach focuses on the distinction between individual beliefs and beliefs about our belief system as a whole. Perhaps you can rationally believe each claim P1 through P500 while also rationally believing the meta-claim that your belief system probably contains error. These are different types of beliefs. First-order beliefs about the world versus second-order beliefs about your own epistemic situation. Consistency requires that your first-order beliefs are consistent with each other, but it doesn't require that your second-order beliefs about your first-order beliefs align perfectly with them. Critics argue this doesn't fully resolve the paradox. If you genuinely believe that your belief system contains error, you should revise your beliefs to remove the error. But you cannot identify which belief to revise, because each seems equally justified. You're left in an unstable epistemic position, knowing you're wrong about something but unable to correct it. This seems like a form of rational incoherence even if it's not strictly logical contradiction. The Preface Paradox connects to the Lottery Paradox. In both cases, you're justified in believing each individual claim in a large set, while also being justified in believing that at least one claim is false. The Lottery Paradox involves tickets that will lose, the Preface Paradox involves claims that are mistaken. Both reveal that rational belief doesn't straightforwardly aggregate. Being justified in believing each of many claims doesn't entail being justified in believing them all together. Some epistemologists embrace fallibilism about rational belief, arguing that inconsistency of the type in the Preface Paradox is unavoidable and acceptable. Finite creatures reasoning about complex matters under uncertainty inevitably hold some beliefs that don't perfectly cohere. Perfect consistency is an ideal we can approximate but never fully achieve. Recognizing this limitation is itself a mark of rationality. The Preface Paradox doesn't reveal a defect in the historian's reasoning but rather an honest acknowledgement of human epistemic limitations. The paradox has practical implications for science, scholarship, and any field requiring synthesis of many claims. Scientists publishing research know that some results won't replicate, but they don't know which ones. Scholars writing textbooks recognize that despite careful editing, some statements will be incorrect. Recognizing this doesn't make them irrational, it makes them appropriately humble. The Preface Paradox suggests we should accept that rational belief systems can have a certain tension between confidence in individual claims and recognition of overall fallibility. Interestingly, the paradox becomes sharper when we consider what the author should do if asked about specific claims. If a reader asks, "Do you believe claim 73 is true?" the historian should answer yes, based on the research supporting it. If asked about claim 215, again the answer is yes. For every individual claim, the answer is yes. But if asked, "Are all your claims true?" the answer should be no. This seems like a form of inconsistency in the author's assertions, even if not in their beliefs. The Preface Paradox also raises questions about assertion and the norms governing it. Perhaps you should only assert what you believe, but you shouldn't assert conjunctions of many beliefs even when you believe each conjunct. Or perhaps there's a distinction between asserting individual claims and endorsing the entire set collectively. The paradox suggests that norms of assertion are more complex than simply asserting what you believe. Some philosophers connect the Preface Paradox to group belief and collective epistemology. When a research team publishes findings, each member might believe each claim, and each member might recognize that teams make errors. The group's belief state exhibits preface structure, believing each claim individually while acknowledging collective fallibility. This suggests that rational group belief naturally involves tensions not present in individual belief, or that group belief requires different norms than individual belief. The paradox also appears in legal contexts. Juries must decide beyond reasonable doubt whether defendants committed crimes. Each individual juror might be convinced of guilt based on evidence, rationally believing all the elements of the crime are proven. Yet the jury collectively might acknowledge that juries sometimes convict innocent people. This creates preface structure, high confidence in this verdict combined with recognition that some verdicts are wrong. What makes the Preface Paradox philosophically important is how it challenges our assumptions about rational consistency. We tend to think rational agents should have consistent beliefs, that if you believe P and believe Q, you should believe P and Q together. The Preface Paradox shows this principle conflicts with other rational requirements like proportioning belief to evidence and acknowledging fallibility. The paradox forces us to reconsider what consistency demands, what rationality requires, and how finite knowers should balance confidence in specific beliefs with humility about overall reliability. It reveals that rationality is messier and more complex than idealized models suggest. The Omniscient Book Paradox. Imagine discovering a mysterious book that claims to contain all true statements about the world and no false ones. The book is supposedly omniscient, a complete and accurate description of reality. Every fact about past, present, and future is recorded within its pages. You open the book and begin reading. You find statements like, "The Earth orbits the Sun," which is true, and "Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo," also true. Everything you can verify checks out perfectly. You begin to trust that the book really is omniscient as claimed. But then you encounter a peculiar statement: "This sentence does not appear in the omniscient book." You pause, puzzled. This sentence appears in the book, you're looking right at it. So the sentence claims something false, namely that it doesn't appear in the book. But the book supposedly contains only true statements. If this sentence appears in the book, it must be true, which means it correctly states it doesn't appear in the book. But it does appear in the book, creating a direct contradiction. Perhaps then this sentence is false, and therefore shouldn't appear in an omniscient book that contains only truths. But you can see it right there on the page. The book seems to refute its own omniscience. This is the Omniscient Book Paradox, a variation on self-referential paradoxes that reveals particular problems with the concept of complete knowledge or total truth. The paradox suggests that the idea of a book or database containing all and only true statements faces logical impossibility. Any purportedly complete collection of truths will exclude certain self-referential truths or include self-referential falsehoods, either way failing to be genuinely omniscient. The paradox operates through self-reference, creating a sentence whose truth value depends on whether it appears in the book, while its appearance in the book depends on its truth value. If the sentence is true, it shouldn't appear in the book, making it false. If it's false, it should appear in the book only if the book contains falsehoods, violating omniscience. Either way, the book cannot coherently be both omniscient and consistent. One response argues that omniscient books simply cannot contain sentences that refer to the book itself. An omniscient book can contain all truths about the external world, about mathematics, about the future, about everything except its own contents. This restriction preserves omniscience about everything except the book itself. The book would be almost omniscient, missing only truths about what appears in the book, which seems like a minor limitation. However, this solution faces problems. Many interesting truths involve statements about collections of truths. If the book cannot contain truths about itself, can it contain truths about truth generally? Can it include the claim all truths are in this book or this book is omniscient? These meta-statements seem to require self-reference. Moreover, if the book omits truths about its own contents, it's not truly omniscient, since omniscience means knowing everything, including facts about collections of knowledge. Another approach distinguishes levels of truth in a hierarchy. First-level truths are about the world, second-level truths are about first-level truths, third-level truths are about second-level truths, and so on. An omniscient book at level N can contain all truths up to level N1 but not truths about itself at level N. This echoes solutions to the liar paradox using hierarchies of language. However, it fragments omniscience into many relative omnisciences rather than achieving absolute omniscience. Some philosophers argue the paradox shows that omniscience itself is an incoherent concept, at least regarding propositions. Just as you cannot have a set of all sets due to Russell's paradox, you cannot have a complete collection of all truths due to self-referential sentences. This doesn't necessarily mean God or omniscient beings are impossible, but it might mean omniscience requires a different model than knowing all true propositions, or having a complete list of truths. The paradox connects to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which prove that any consistent mathematical system strong enough to express arithmetic cannot prove all truths expressible in that system. The omniscient book paradox suggests a similar result for truth. Any consistent collection of truths cannot contain all truths, because self-referential truths about the collection itself create incompleteness or inconsistency. Interestingly, the paradox has theological implications. Classical theology often attributes omniscience to God, meaning God knows all truths. But if the concept of all truths is incoherent due to self-reference problems, what does divine omniscience mean? Some theologians respond that God's knowledge isn't propositional, not a matter of knowing a list of true sentences, but rather direct acquaintance with reality. God doesn't know truths about the world, God knows the world itself immediately. This conception bypasses the paradox by rejecting the assumption that knowledge consists of collections of propositions. Others argue that God, being outside logic or above logic, can coherently know things that create contradictions when we finite beings try to express them. Divine omniscience might transcend the limitations revealed by the paradox, not by solving it within logic but by existing beyond logical constraints. Critics respond that this makes omniscience mysterious rather than explaining it, and that exempting God from logic risks making theological claims meaningless. The omniscient book paradox also appears in discussions of artificial intelligence and information systems. Could we create a database containing all true information? The paradox suggests fundamental limits. Any database that includes information about itself faces potential self-reference problems. Modern computer systems must carefully manage self-referential data structures to avoid crashes or logical errors, suggesting the paradox has practical computational relevance. In library science and information theory, the paradox relates to the fantasy of a universal encyclopedia or complete knowledge base. The paradox implies that perfect completeness is logically impossible. Any encyclopedia that includes entries about encyclopedias, or any knowledge base that contains information about knowledge bases, cannot achieve perfect completeness and consistency simultaneously. The paradox connects to the concept of intentional versus extensional definitions. An omniscient book might be defined intentionally as the book containing all and only true statements. But this intentional definition may not correspond to any possible extension, any actual book that could exist. The concept describes something contradictory, not something impossible to create practically but impossible in principle. Some logicians explore paraconsistent approaches where the omniscient book can contain contradictions without destroying its usefulness. If the sentence, "This sentence does not appear in the omniscient book," is both true and false, and if the logical system can contain such contradictions without implying everything is true, then perhaps an omniscient book is possible after all. This preserves the concept by revising logic rather than revising omniscience. The paradox also raises questions about whether truth itself is well defined. Perhaps all truths is not a coherent totality, not because of practical limitations but because truth doesn't form a completed whole. Truth might be indefinitely extensible. For any collection of truths, we can generate new truths about that collection, and this process never terminates. Omniscience would then be impossible not because of limitations on knowledge but because there's no complete set of truths to know. What makes the omniscient book paradox philosophically significant is how it challenges the concept of complete knowledge. We often think of knowledge as accumulative, that we can keep adding truths and approach omniscience asymptotically. The paradox suggests this picture is wrong. Completeness itself is incoherent, and attempts to achieve it generate contradiction. This has implications for epistemology, theology, information science, and our understanding of what knowledge and truth are. The paradox reveals that self-reference places fundamental limits not just on what we can know but on what can coherently be known. The Paradox of Knowability. Consider all the truths about the world, everything that is actually true regardless of whether anyone knows it. Some truths are known. We know the earth is round, we know water is H2O, we know Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Other truths remain unknown. Perhaps there's a specific number of grains of sand on a particular beach, a true statement that nobody has ever counted or will count. Now consider this philosophical principle: all truths are knowable. This seems reasonable and optimistic. It doesn't claim we actually know everything, just that in principle, any truth could be known if we investigated properly. There are no truths permanently hidden from possible knowledge, no facts that are necessarily unknowable. But philosopher Frederick Fitch discovered that this innocent-seeming principle leads to a startling conclusion: if all truths are knowable, then all truths are actually known. The knowability principle collapses into the absurd claim that there are no unknown truths, that we already know everything true. This seems obviously false since we're clearly ignorant of countless facts, yet it appears to follow logically from the modest claim that all truths are knowable. This is the paradox of knowability, or Fitch's paradox. Here's how the paradox works. Suppose there's some truth P that nobody knows. Then the statement, P is true and nobody knows P, is also true. It accurately describes the situation. Now apply the knowability principle. If this statement is true, it must be knowable. So in principle, someone could know that P is true and nobody knows P. But this is impossible. If someone knows this statement, they know P, which contradicts the part of the statement saying nobody knows P. The statement, P is true and nobody knows P, cannot possibly be known, even though it's true. So we found a truth that's not knowable, violating our principle that all truths are knowable. The only way to preserve the knowability principle is to deny that there are any truths of the form, P is true and nobody knows P. But such truths exist only when P is true and unknown. So there can be no unknown truths. Everything true must be known. The modest principle that all truths are knowable entails the radical conclusion that all truths are known, that human ignorance doesn't exist, which is absurd. One response restricts what kinds of statements count as truths or can be known. Perhaps statements like, P is true and nobody knows P, aren't genuine truths in the relevant sense, because they're essentially self-defeating when it comes to knowledge. Only non-reflexive truths, truths that don't refer to knowledge states, need to be knowable. This preserves the intuition that all ordinary truths about the world are knowable while excluding the problematic self-referential statements. However, critics argue this solution is ad hoc. The statement, P is true and nobody knows P, seems like a perfectly ordinary truth when P is unknown. Why should we exclude it? Moreover, the solution requires drawing a principled line between reflexive and non-reflexive truths, which proves difficult. Many statements implicitly involve knowledge, historical claims about what people believed, psychological claims about awareness, counterfactuals about what would be discovered under certain conditions. Another approach questions the logic used in Fitch's proof. The paradox assumes that if P and Q is knowable, then both P and Q must be individually knowable. But perhaps knowledge doesn't distribute over conjunction in this way. Maybe some conjunctions are knowable even when their individual conjuncts aren't, or when knowing the conjunction is impossible despite each part being knowable separately. Revising the logic of knowledge operators might block the paradox. Some philosophers distinguish between different notions of possibility involved in knowable. Perhaps knowable means knowable by some possible being in some possible world, not necessarily knowable in the actual world by actual humans. Under this interpretation, unknown truths are knowable in the sense that a different world with different knowers or different evidence could contain knowledge of them, even if actual humans never discover them. This preserves knowability without collapsing it into actual knowledge. The paradox has theological implications. If God is omniscient, knowing all truths, then there are no unknown truths, and the paradox's conclusion is actually correct. From a theological perspective, the paradox might support rather than refute the knowability principle by showing it entails divine omniscience. However, this only works if we accept that God exists and is omniscient, which isn't common ground in epistemological debates. Verificationists face particular challenges from the paradox. Verificationism claims that meaningful statements are those that can be verified or known to be true. But Fitch's paradox suggests that making all truths verifiable in principle entails that all truths are actually verified, which seems far too strong. Verificationists must either accept this consequence, restrict their principle, or explain why the paradox doesn't apply to their position. The paradox connects to debates about realism versus anti-realism about truth. Realists think truths exist independently of knowledge, there are mind-independent facts. Anti-realists think truth is essentially linked to verification or knowledge, nothing is true unless it could be known. Fitch's paradox creates problems for anti-realists by suggesting that linking truth to knowability leads to absurd consequences unless we accept that everything true is known, which seems to collapse anti-realism into idealism. Some philosophers embraced the paradox's conclusion in limited domains. In mathematics, some argue that mathematical truths just are what can be proved, so all mathematical truths are knowable because truth is defined through provability. Fitch's paradox wouldn't apply because there's no gap between truth and knowability. However, this verificationist approach to mathematics faces independent objections and doesn't address the paradox for empirical domains. Interestingly, the paradox reveals something about the logic of knowledge and its interaction with negation and conjunction. Knowledge behaves strangely with certain logical operations. While you can know P and separately know Q, you might not be able to know P and Q if the conjunction has special properties. Similarly, you might not be able to know P or Q without knowing which disjunct is true. These peculiarities of knowledge ascription become acute in self-referential cases. The paradox also appears in discussions of privacy and secrecy. Are there necessarily unknowable secrets, things that by their nature cannot be known by certain people? The paradox suggests that if we maintain that such secrets are nevertheless knowable in principle, we run into contradictions. Perhaps genuine secrets require denying universal knowability, accepting that some truths are necessarily unknowable by some knowers. What makes the paradox of knowability philosophically important is how it challenges the relationship between truth and knowledge. We want to maintain that truth is one thing and knowledge another, that there are truths we don't know but could discover. Yet Fichte's simple logical argument suggests that making all truths knowable paradoxically means all truths must be known. The paradox forces epistemologists to carefully examine what knowability means, whether knowability principles should be restricted, and how knowledge relates to truth and possibility. It remains one of the most surprising and difficult results in contemporary epistemology, showing that even seemingly innocuous principles about knowledge can harbor hidden contradictions. The circle of paradox. Imagine a piece of paper with only 2 sentences written on it. The first sentence reads, "The second sentence on this paper is false." The second sentence reads, "The first sentence on this paper is true." You begin analyzing these sentences to determine their truth values. If the first sentence is true, then the second sentence is false. But if the second sentence is false, then the first sentence is not true, contradicting our assumption. So the first sentence cannot be true. Perhaps then the first sentence is false, which means the second sentence is not false, so it's true. But if the second sentence is true, then the first sentence is true, contradicting our assumption that it's false. We're caught in an endless circle, unable to consistently assign truth values to either sentence. This is the circle of paradox, also known as Yablow's paradox in some formulations, or simply circular liar paradoxes. Unlike the simple liar paradox with a single self-referential sentence, the circle involves multiple sentences referring to each other in ways that create paradoxical loops. The circle can involve 2 sentences as in our example, or 3, or any number, creating chains or networks of reference that ultimately loop back on themselves. Consider a 3-sentence circle. Sentence A says, sentence B is false. Sentence B says, sentence C is false. Sentence C says, sentence A is false. Try to determine truth values. If A is true, then B is false. If B is false, then C is not false, so C is true. If C is true, then A is false, contradicting our starting assumption. The reasoning circles back, preventing consistent truth value assignment. No matter which sentence you start with or what truth value you assume, you eventually reach contradiction. These circular paradoxes reveal that self-reference isn't necessary for paradox, circular reference suffices. The liar sentence, "This sentence is false," refers to itself, creating paradox through self-reference. But the circle of paradox shows you can generate paradoxes without any sentence referring to itself, as long as sentences refer to each other in loops. This suggests the problem isn't specifically self-reference but rather reference patterns that allow circular dependencies. Philosophers and logicians have proposed solutions paralleling those for the simple liar paradox. One approach declares circular statements meaningless or ill-formed. Just as self-referential truth claims might be rejected as semantic pathology, circular truth claims can be excluded from meaningful language. We could prohibit sentences from forming reference cycles, requiring that sentence A can only refer to sentence B if B doesn't refer back to it directly or indirectly. However, this solution faces practical problems. Natural language and reasoning inherently involve circular patterns. Scientific theories contain propositions that support each other mutually. Legal systems have laws that refer to other laws that refer back. Ordinary conversation includes statements about previous statements that referred to earlier statements. Banning all circularity would cripple language and thought. We need a more nuanced approach that distinguishes benign from problematic circularity. Another solution employs 3-valued logic where sentences can be true, false, or undefined. Sentences in paradoxical circles receive the undefined value, neither true nor false. This technical move allows logic to continue functioning even when some sentences lack classical truth values. The circle of paradoxical sentences becomes a neutral zone where truth value doesn't apply, preventing the paradox from spreading through the logical system. Critics argue that 3-valued logic doesn't fully resolve the paradox but rather accommodates it. We still don't understand why these sentences lack truth values or what their semantic status is. Saying they're undefined seems like giving up on solving the paradox rather than explaining it. Moreover, three-valued logic creates new questions about how undefined sentences interact with defined ones in reasoning and inference. Para-consistent approaches allow the sentences in the circle to be both true and false simultaneously without causing logical explosion. The circle can consistently assign contradictory truth values as long as contradictions are contained and don't imply everything. This treats the paradox as a real feature of language rather than something to be eliminated or avoided. Defenders argue this is more honest about the actual logical structure of natural language. The circle of paradox connects to graph theory and computer science. Reference relationships can be represented as directed graphs where nodes are sentences and edges are reference relations. Paradoxes arise in graphs containing certain types of cycles. Computer scientists dealing with databases and knowledge representation must handle circular references carefully to avoid crashes or inconsistencies. The logical problems translate directly into computational ones. Interestingly, infinite versions of the circle exist. The Yablo paradox involves an infinite sequence of sentences, each saying all subsequent sentences are false. No sentence refers to itself or to any earlier sentence, so there's no circularity in the usual sense. Yet the infinite sequence produces paradox similar to circular cases. This shows that even non-circular reference patterns can generate paradox if they have appropriate structure. The circle of paradox also appears in epistemology regarding mutual justification. Suppose belief A justifies belief B justifies belief C, and belief C justifies belief A. This creates a circular justification structure. Some philosophers argue circular justification is inherently problematic, requiring beliefs to ultimately rest on non-circular foundations. Others defend coherentist views where beliefs can justify each other mutually through circular support. The circle of paradox provides a stark case testing these positions. In artificial intelligence, circular references in knowledge bases or rule systems can cause problems similar to the circle of paradox. An AI system with rules that refer to each other circularly might enter infinite loops or produce contradictory conclusions. Engineers must design systems carefully to detect and handle cycles. Some argue this shows that human-like intelligence requires mechanisms for managing circular concepts that formal systems struggle with. The paradox has literary and philosophical echoes in discussions of circular reasoning and definition. Can you define terms using other terms that ultimately depend on the original terms? Dictionaries inherently involve circularity since words are defined using other words. Yet dictionaries function adequately, suggesting that some types of circularity are acceptable. The circle of paradox might reveal that not all circularity is equally problematic, and we need better understanding of when circles cause problems. Some philosophers see the circle of paradox as evidence that natural language is fundamentally illogical or inconsistent. We can construct meaningful-seeming sentences that generate contradiction. This doesn't mean we should abandon natural language, but it might mean we shouldn't expect natural language to conform perfectly to formal logic. Language is a practical tool shaped by evolution and culture, not a formal system designed for logical consistency. Others argue the paradox shows that truth is more complex than the simple correspondence theory suggests. Perhaps truth isn't simply a property sentences have or lack, but rather involves contextual and holistic factors. A sentence's truth value might depend not just on the world but on the broader linguistic and conceptual system it inhabits. Circular reference patterns might prevent sentences from having stable truth values because they lack sufficient grounding in the system. What makes the circle of paradox philosophically significant is how it generalizes self-reference paradoxes and shows that the problems go deeper than originally thought. Solutions targeting self-reference specifically won't handle circular cases. The paradox reveals that reference patterns themselves can be pathological, that the structure of how statements relate to each other can generate contradiction independently of their content. This challenges us to understand what makes some reference patterns acceptable and others paradoxical, touching fundamental questions about meaning, truth, and the logical structure of language.